module bundler. And what that does is it takes a bunch of different libraries and whatnot, and it bundles them and compresses them into a package that you can serve up. And then Babel is our JavaScript transpiler. So what that allows us to do, because you can have, for example, browsers that don't support the latest version of JavaScript, for example. For example, arrow functions is something that you wouldn't see in ECMAScript 5, which ECMAScript is the official name for JavaScript. We're typically writing a lot of our code in ECMAScript 6. And so what Babel can do is it can actually transpile, and transpile means convert it from one language or one version of a language to another. And not only does it convert that, but it actually, what you'll see is React has its own flavor of sort of like a mixture of HTML and JavaScript called JSX. And what you'll see is it looks almost like HTML, but then you can put JavaScript inside of it. And Babel can take that and convert it straight to good old JavaScript. So these things are actually running under the hood. We're not going to get really into the details of how these work, but just to give you guys some background in case you get curious, you want to do some digging. So let's get started with HTML, right? The web browser parses HTML to generate a document object model within its memory. So what does that mean? Essentially, when you write an HTML page, it's formatted with a bunch of these tags. Now, these tags are nested, right? You start off by describing what the document is with your doc type. And then you see this initial tag, which is has the no indentation as HTML. The next thing you should always see is a head tag, and then you'll see a body tag, right? And if you look at this diagram over here on the right, it gives you a visual representation of how these different things are nested. And nomenclature of the DOM, which this is like your document object model. Things that are nested within other tags are considered children. And then similarly, if multiple children have the same parent, then they're considered siblings, right? And also just a note, this body tag, whatever is in the body tag, you can actually consider this essentially the viewport of your web page. What comes in here in the head is usually metadata. For example, this title tag actually represents what you'll see in the tab when you open this up in your browser. So all this is stuff that doesn't show up in the viewport, and we'll see a little bit more of that as we go. So how does CSS fit into this? So CSS is in its own right a different markup language. Now, markup, when I say markup language, it's not like HTML and CSS aren't considered programming languages in their own right. And that's because they don't implement all the logic that you would need to have like a Turing complete language. Markup actually takes its name back to old script writers when they would sit there and mark up their scripts in terms of different patterns and whatnot to try to call things out. And that's essentially what you see here in HTML. For example, like a H1 tag says, I want this to be a header. A P tag would say, I want this to be a paragraph, for example, and it'll style those appropriately. Now, what you see here inside of the head tag is this style tag here, right? Now, inside of the style tag, that's where you can start writing CSS, all right? So if we were to have opened that previous page, you'd see something like this without any colors. So what have we done here? We can see this H1, which is called my home page. It has an ID called header1, and you can use in CSS what are called selectors, right? So a hashtag will allow you to select precisely an ID, and we can change the color. Color in CSS just means just the text color. And then if you want to change, for example, the background color of an element, we're saying any P tag in here, right? So instead of trying to grab a single ID, we can target any of a particular tag as well. So we're saying all P tags, just give them a background color of red, and that's what you see here. So I'm gonna give you guys a demo. This is actually a really, really neat site, CSS Sin Garden. So let's go there. All right, so just to give everybody a feel of really, what is the separation between HTML and CSS? HTML, like we were showing in that technology slide, is it's your structure, it's your content, right? And CSS really is just kind of your layout and your style. And it's kind of incredible what you can do by just changing CSS. So this CSS Zen Garden is a web page that it's a sort of a competition. So they provide the exact same HTML, right? So you can come in here and you can download the HTML for this page, and then they'll give you like a default CSS file. But the part of the competition is to write your own CSS file to redesign the page, and this is the default. So just keep note of what this first paragraph says, a demonstration of which, as well as this first header, the road to enlightenment. So we'll check out some different ones here. This is mid-century modern, right? Like I showed you before here, a demonstration of what can be accomplished. It's the same content, right? You can see that road to enlightenment down here. So all of the text on this page is literally the same. The HTML did not change in this. Everything that you see here is done by CSS. And we can go on number 2. So it's drastically different, right? But then again, you're seeing the exact same text, right? And in this case, let's see if we can find where we put that header. So yeah, the road to enlightenment.
I suspect that they actually hit it.
Yeah.
I think it's the CSS was none, display none on that one. So you can, with CSS, actually drop out specific parts of the HTML.
Yeah, we're gonna actually check that out here. So if you come up here, this is the Google developer tools, and you can find that by coming up to the top right. There's the menu option here. Go down to more tools, and then you'll see developer tools. If you're on a Mac, the shortcut should be Option Command J to open these tools up. And I imagine on Windows it should be Alt Control J as well. But if that's not the case, you can still find it up here through this menu. Now, what we're going to do is we're actually going to look at sources on this page here. So what do we have? All right, we've got an I folder, S, here's an index. This looks like it's a CSS file, right? So let's just see if we can get rid of this, all this CSS. All right. So just like BJ said, the content's here, but it was hidden, right? So this is a page literally with no custom CSS added. It's just the default CSS settings for each of these tags.
Hey, it looks like your vehicle HTML page, Justin.
Exactly. So I'll go in here and show you some of the ones I think are really neat. There's some of them that they get quite crazy. I think it's the steel one where they use CSS animations. All right. So a lot of people say, right, it's JavaScript is what makes a page dynamic. You can say, well, if this isn't using JavaScript to do this, how's it dynamic? And one of the things to note is CSS can actually do animations as well. All right, so the dynamic portion is more to do with the actual data model and the behavior of the page. And you can also change the layout and the view of the page as well with JavaScript. But CSS has these kind of abilities as well. And if you want to make some kind of animation, make things move. All right, so anybody got any questions?
I will mention that we won't spend a ton of time with CSS because we could spend an entire boot camp on design principles and stuff like that. That's a whole other area. And as engineers, we are typically not expected to be great designers, so that's good. But just so you know, typically a designer will give you a tool. Like if they a designer will give you something, they'll give you a pretty picture and say implement this. And so at least you guys will know, okay, I can get familiar enough with CSS to get to something if that ever happens. Chances are, you guys are engineers and pretty hardcore engineers. Chances are you won't be, trying to implement something that looks like this. I'm
Right.
not sure there's too many technical dashboards that require this level of animation, but it is a differentiator, right? I mean, if you can make something look good, presentation's half the battle, if not more. 90% presentation, 10% ability, right? I mean, that's really life. So, if you the nicer you can make something look, the better. So we do spend a significant amount of time in our products, Modesto, Technicity, really taking a look at how something looks and how you interact with it in the user experience, because that's really what differentiates between an average experience and a really above average experience. And it's things like CSS that kind of allow you to get there. So we won't spend a ton of time on it, but just so you guys know, that's how these crazy websites and cool things that you see, that's how they get it. A combination of HTML, JavaScript, and CSS.
Yeah, thank you, BJ. So what am I showing here? We've shown HTML, CSS so far, right? Now, how does JavaScript fit into this picture? So we have an idea of what is the DOM, right? You define a page with HTML. That initial page gets loaded up into the browser, and then a DOM gets generated from the HTML content in that page. And the important thing to note is the DOM is what's in memory in the browser, right? So your DOM can deviate from what you initially had on that HTML page. Typically, it'll deviate due to JavaScript running on the page, manipulating the DOM. And in particular, how does that happen? Well, the DOM can be manipulated via the browser's web API. And there are loads of different commands that you can use within a browser. All right. So let's actually do a quick example here. We're going to build a small HTML page. So what I've done here, let me shut this down. This is from the demo that we were just given earlier. All right, so I've got our dev environment. I'm opened up into a container. All right, and then I've got a folder in here called week 3 live. So, and this, what I've done is I've grabbed all the contents that we had from week 2 and then copied them here as a starting point. So let's just make a folder called HTML example. All right, and we're gonna make a file called index.html. One thing, if you guys are following along, a good plugin to install for just testing out HTML pages on their own is called Live Server. So this Live Server plugin created by Ritwik Day, it allows you to simply right-click on your index.html file once you get it up and running, and then serve that up on a web browser. Now this isn't actually installed in this dev container, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to reopen locally for now. That way we can use that live server plugin. All right, so this is that same index.html. You have to start off all of your HTML files with a doc type definition, right? So this is doctype.html. That finished automatically because I've got another plugin in here called HTML snippets, which is really handy. So it'll actually detect what kind of HTML tags that you're trying to write out, and then it'll autocomplete them for you. And then next tag we're going to have is called HTML. We need to have a head tag or a header tag, right? Inside of our header, we'll have a title tag, and we'll just call this HTML example. then we give it a body tag. All right, and if you remember what I mentioned, the body tag, that's your viewport. And so we'll put an H1 in there, which is a one level header. So this is an H1, right? We'll put an H2 in there. This is an H2, right? And what you'll see is they increasingly get smaller, right? And then we'll put a small paragraph tag in there. Call it hello world, right? Now that I've got this written, I can serve it up with that live server plugin. So if I click here, you'll see this option, open with live server. Now this will start up a server typically on port 5500, and it'll open it up. So not a very fancy page, right? You can see here's our H1 tag. This is our H2 tag, and then we've got our little paragraph tag saying hello world. Now, if we look at our dev tools, it's really nice. You can actually come over here to elements, and you can see the HTML loaded up. Now down here, remember what I said, not everything that goes in the DOM is what goes in the HTML page. So that live server actually injected a little bit of JavaScript in here, right? And it's doing some of its own stuff with the WebSockets and whatnot. So, and that's because it does hot reloading. Just to give you an example, I can make another p tag here, call it hello again, and as soon as I save this, it'll already show up. That's all that JavaScript is doing at the moment. All right, so let's try to manipulate this a little bit. If you come into the console, one of the things that you'll notice that the web browser actually injects and makes available via JavaScript is the document variable. So this is actually a global variable here. And you can see if you open this up, it's got reference to the entire document. So let's check out some of these different commands. All right, so what's this first one? Document get element by ID. All right, if you recall that example, the CSS we were showing before, you can specify an ID in the tag. So let's go ahead and let's grab one of our elements and put an ID on it. All right, I'm just going to call this A1 for the ID. That's our header 1. Now that this is loaded back up, if you check elements here, you can see the ID's made its way in. And then I will create a variable, just call it header1, and then you can say document get element by ID, and actually pass in what's our header here, A1. Right? And now if you look at header1, you can see we have a reference to it, right? You can do a lot of things in here. Once you have a reference to it, you can change the inner text. So I can say this is in H1, make an exclamation point there. And you see I can change it right there, right? And so we're already grabbing things off the DOM and manipulating them. Another one that's really useful, you have a reference to window instead of just document. Now window also gives you access to what's going on here in your URL. All right, so just like document, we've got our window reference. Right, one of the ones you can look at is called window.location. Right, and that'll even show you, for example, what you've got inside of your URL. And the one that we were showing here is called window history. Right, so what can I do? For window history, I can actually push state onto it. I can say window.history, push state. Now, to know the actual API for interacting with these little, this web API, you just go and look at the documents. I provided a link down here that's really good, developer.mozilla.org. They have a huge amount of content. So if you open this up, this is all of your reference documentation for any of these commands that we're going over tonight. And so, for example, you want to look at document. If you come in here to document, you'll be able to find all the different API calls available to document, right? And it's just got a huge list of the properties down here. So if we say get element by ID, right, it'll show you need to pass a string into there, right? So if you're curious on where I'm, like how I know what arguments need to be passed in, it's just based off reference documentation like this. So we're going to push, we don't need to really have any state, but what we want to do is we want to change this URL, right? So open this back up. We'll just call this page home, right? And you can see what was up here before. Now we see home at the end. And so what you can do with this is what will allow you to really control what's shown up in the URL. And this gets important when you're talking about working with what's called single page applications. So traditionally, what was always done before was when you come up with a website, it's composed of multiple HTML files. And so when you want to go from one part of the site to another, it would actually have to do a request to the server, load that HTML file, and then render the new page. Whereas for single page applications or SPAs, you load almost all the website at once, at least all of the visual content in HTML, and then you dynamically change the DOM while the user navigates. But you want to give the sensation that you're navigating around different points on the website. And to do that, you need to be able to overwrite what's going on in the URL, right? And so we'll do that a lot with React, because React is a library that specializes in making SPAs. And so this is under the hood how React is doing that. So one of the other ones that's really interesting, so add event listener, right? So one type of event that we could listen to would be a click event, right? Maybe on some kind of a hyperlink tag, right? And so what we can do here, what we'll do is we'll actually use this document.createElement method. We'll create an element, and then we're going to add it to the body, and then we'll add an event listener to it. So let's try that out. So I want to make let's just say a link element. We'll say document.createElement. And then the argument that you pass into document.createElement is the type of tag that you want to make. So we're going to make an A tag, which is typically what you use to create hyperlinks. So that's been created. I have a reference to it, but it's not on the DOM yet. If you look here, you will not see an A tag anywhere, right? So one of the things that we're going to do is we'll say document. And we have, what's nice is with document, you have a direct reference to that body tag. You can see what's highlighted here for body. It's everything, right? And then we'll append a child. We'll give it we'll say link element. All right, that appended an empty link element. If you look here, we've got an empty link element at the end. And let's put some text in there. So you can say enter text, just like before, click me. All right, so now it showed. And now you're not seeing that blue pattern, right, with the underline, and that's because you need a hyperlink here. So we'll say link element .href, right? We'll just have it go to google.com. Right now, you can see that it can be clicked. But what if we don't actually want this, for example, to go to google.com, or I could just make the href blank, but I want it to have an action. Well, what we can do there is we can use this add event listener, right? So we're gonna have a reference, which is our target. In this case, this is the A tag, and we're gonna add an event listener to it. And so we can say here, link element, add event listener. Now the way this works is you can see the type of event you wanna listen to, and then the listener function. So we wanna listen to the click event. And now I'm gonna pass in a function, and this is our listener. All right, so the first thing you need to do is what's called prevent default. The default behavior is actually to reload the page and go to whatever link is there. So we wanna deactivate that, all right? And then the next thing I wanna do is just say a console log, and I can say, you clicked me. Right, we'll close off that function. Let's finish this out. So we added an event listener. So what happens here? If I click this, you can see you click me showing up on the screen. So that's about all we're going to do here directly in the console. But that's just to kind of give you guys an idea that this web API to be able to manipulate the DOM is just available directly through your browser. And specifically, we need to be running in Google Chrome. All the commands I'm using are compatible with Google Chrome. If you look in these web APIs here, what you'll see in the end of the sections, this is a kind of an important segue. Let me get element by ID. So each of these methods, you go into their main page for the reference documentation, particularly on the MDM web docs, they'll show you a table of browser compatibility. And this is where the libraries like React and Babel really help. So not all web APIs are the same for each of the browsers, right? And so when you're using a particular command with the web API, you need to make sure the browsers that you're supporting are actually, they support that particular command, right? And I'm sure, BJ, you can probably speak to this a little better about how much of a pain that was in the past.
It is still a pain. It hasn't gone away. You act like this isn't a thing anymore, but this is what makes front-end development, especially on the web, so frustrating. Is everyone's got their own little flavor, right? We all know about standards. There are none. Everyone's got their own little flavor of standard of how browsers are implemented, and that's why there's so much tooling that goes on. What Justin mentioned earlier about Babel and the transpolations and those things. That's all to protect against all these different versions and compatibilities of all these browsers. Now, to talk a little bit about compatibility, you do have basically a centering around Chrome. And if you notice, the browser that really started to get us, that was really frustrating to all of us as front-end developers, was Internet Explorer. But you've noticed that over time, Internet Explorer, it was phased out, right? I think 11 was the last one. It became Edge, right? And now, just recently, Microsoft has just gone all in and took the open source Chrome browser and they implemented the new Edge, or whatever they're calling it now. And so now, all of Microsoft's browsers are actually running with the V8 engine, the Chrome engine for JavaScript, meaning though now Chrome and Microsoft have a very similar browser basis. This is a very interesting strategy. You also have Safari. Safari's now become the problem child. Safari's never easy to deal with. And Firefox, it's pretty good. They do a pretty good job of keeping up with things. There's slight things. And when we say it doesn't work, it's very rare that you'll get to a point where things just don't work flat out, like a website doesn't load or something. You'll probably get about 95% of the way there, most of the time using most of the same tools. It's that last 5% that's really frustrating. So why doesn't that look that way? Or why is this shifted over a little bit? Or this one specific functionality with this JavaScript function, it doesn't quite work the way I expect it to work. And that's where a lot of the challenges and frustrations come in with this browser compatibility. And that's why we rely on tools, once again, like transpilation tools like Babel and things to get it all down to basically handle all the different things. It's getting better and better every day, but we still kind of live in this frustrating world from a front-end perspective, making things completely kind of ubiquitous support-wise.
So what do the numbers mean across the bottom? Because you've got Chrome and Firefox and Safari and Android all have the same number.
Those would be
those would be perfect. Yeah, those are.
So it says that like Chrome version 1 that'll work in that and it'll work in any subsequent version?
Correct. Yeah, that would be like the first one it was supported in. If you notice, like version 1, right? Well, the reason that these version 1 is supported is because it just so happens that function that JC is showing you is one of the most basic, most core fundamental things within JavaScript of manipulating the document object model. So that's why it may look weird. Like, what are the numbers? Well, a lot of them are 1. Well, because they literally are supported since version 1. They literally had to. It's interesting. Is Netscape on there? Yeah, they dropped Netscape. It's not even a thing anymore. But if you kind of look at some of the older browsers, right? Well, Edge right there, right? Why is it 12? Well, because Edge is actually just the colloquial name for Internet Explorer 12. And Internet Explorer 11, I guess 5.5 is supported, but they started at version 12, on Edge. So it's kind of a weird thing, but that's what those numbers are.
So do you have to, as a developer, do you have to decide whether it's going to work better on a computer, like an internet, or the phone?
Yeah, oftentimes, yeah. So we won't talk a ton about that. We'll talk about more of that in an advanced front end in a couple weeks. But yes, there is a concept of responsiveness, and typically now when we design stuff, it's mobile first, what we call mobile first, and so you actually kind of optimize for a phone. You've probably noticed a trend in landing page design of websites where you get these long bars, right? Big pictures, and there's you scroll down, right? And it's kind of trendy that way and thing. That's actually done because those sites have all been defined as mobile first sites. And if you think about it, how does a site translate from a desktop to a phone? Well, those really long strips as you go down and you scroll down is a lot easier to map to a mobile platform and a smaller screen than the traditional other kinds of stuff that you might see. So that's why you do see what we call responsive websites, where you can kind of shift back and forth. There's things like media queries and things so that you use in CSS, so that you use the same HTML code base, right? That's to JC's point of that Zen Garden thing. You can use all those different things and be able to do that. What JC is going to show you right here is how this is shifting, right? And why don't you click the responsive button up there to get the actual phone? So if you go there, this actually you can test it in different phones. And so when you want to do demos, or you might have even seen me before, right? When I say, oh, this is how it's going to look in an iPhone, this is all I'm doing is just open up the dev tools and then doing that. And you'll notice that how these things kind of expand and contract. That's a responsive it's called being responsive in your web design.
Yeah, and that'll dock you on search engine optimization as well, for example, right? If you have a website that's not responsive, Google won't put you as high on their rankings.
Yeah.
Just in this manipulation that you did now using here and those commands, would you be saving it back to your original HTML file, or?
No, so that was just a live example of how to use the web API and to manipulate the DOM.
Okay.
But what we will be doing is we'll actually be writing a JavaScript file that goes and sets up our page on its own to basically take you to what the demo that I showed at the beginning of the class.
But Sona's point is actually really interesting, because you might think Justin was actually modifying the document object model there, right? He was able to see the code on this web page that we don't control, right? This developer.mozilla. Justin, go in and change something. Go change that title in there. So we're going to just go and change this title right here directly in the HTML. There you go. We actually changed that code. We made that page look different, which we don't control. Did we change it on the server? No. And this is a really critical piece of understanding, so I'm glad you brought this up. Because what we're actually doing here is we're only modifying what is client side. So you can think about what I'm saying is actually very very important from a security and privacy standpoint. Because anything that you view in your browser, client side, is completely viewable from anybody in the world who can access your website. So if you're storing secrets in your HTML or secrets in your code, when I say secrets like passwords, things like that, that's a really big no-no, because that client-side stuff is completely exposed. And you know, you don't have any ability to change anything on the server. So if Justin now refreshes this page,
It will come
he's
back.
going to go back to that server, right, and get the HTML back. If he refreshes, well, it changes back, right? So we really only manipulated it on our side, on our client side, our browser. So you can think about when you're coding a front end, always think, all right, this is out of my stewardship. When this thing gets deployed, in every case, it's always out of my stewardship. I have no ability to control this. I can only provide what I can, and then anything that's in there is going to be open for everyone to see. So you have to be very careful about that and very strategic about that. And there's ways to obfuscate and all these different things, but you know, it's kind of like sharing your MATLAB code, right? Like if you share your MATLAB code, anyone can see it because it's an interpreted language. There's things like P code and things. So there's things like WebAssembly that people use, but in the end, you can still figure it out. It may just be a little bit harder. So that's one of the really critical things to think about when you're coding this is there is no secrecy. Whereas in the back end, no one sees anything, right? You choose what people see, specifically this stuff, right? The JSON, it could be coded in whatever you want, but it's really that. So that's something to really keep in mind and really critical to understanding how these things work back and forth. And when we start talking about security and cybersecurity and consideration on design and architecture, where these things actually go. And I think JC will get into that as we're going and coding, you know, displaying that vehicle data and stuff like that. We'll kind of see that evolve through.
Yeah, and a funny application of just changing the HTML on client side is getting past poorly made paywalls.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
sometimes,
So yeah, like New York Times, you can actually go in and modify. You know, New York Times makes you pay for the articles or whatever. You can actually go in, and what they're doing is they're just tracking cookies and stuff. So once you go in, you just delete certain things, and you can get the full article.
yeah. So if somebody doesn't design it right, it's pretty easy to go in and just change the HTML. Like if they put a modal in front of the article.
Yep.
So
Yeah, just go and delete the modal.
yeah, and then you see what's behind it. So you have to be if you're doing something like that, you should be careful, know what you're doing in terms of actually implementing a paywall correctly. So all right, so we have an idea of what is the web API now. Okay, and that's where we just went through the demo. And I want to give you guys an idea of what the architecture that we typically use for our backend and front end systems. All right. So what you see here in your browser is set up with this HTML icon, right? So we've got our HTML, our CSS, and our JavaScript all running the front end app in the web browser, right? Now, to do this with our systems, we actually have two different servers. Okay. The first server that your browser hits when you go to a web page, so you type in the domain and it goes and gets an IP address from a DNS server, and it goes and requests that web page for that domain from that particular server. This server will respond with typically with content type text HTML. So it's feeding back HTML, CSS, those kind of files to your browser. Now, with our architecture, we're not going back to the same server, at least not back to this exact same port for our dynamic data, right? For, in our case, our vehicle data, right? Maybe user information, those kind of things. That data is typically stored in our backend server. So this is the server we've been running on port 9500, right? And our choice of content type is application JSON. So those are the JSON objects. They're going to be coming back, and that we use that to encode all the types of data between. It could be strings, numbers, whatever you want. But that is essentially the architecture. And I wanted to point that out because the first thing that we're actually going to do tonight, once we start putting this front end together, is not write the HTML page. We're going to start putting together this localhost 3000, which is actually what that live server plugin that I was just using did on port 5500 before we were going through the demo. So we're going to write our own because it just gives us more control over what's going on, especially when we start going to that window.history push state and we're trying to manipulate the URL. We really need to be able to control the way this server handles the way it feeds pages and whatnot. All right. Any questions on this? Okay, let's go ahead. Now, let's start coding this guy up. Okay. I'm gonna make a folder in here. I'm gonna call it front end basic. And I'm gonna close this down and open this project back up within our container, because we don't need that plugin anymore. So the first thing that we're going to do once this loads up is we're actually going to make an Express server, just like with the backend, right? Except this particular Express server is going to serve up our front end code. I guess while we wait to load this up, I'll explain the thought process here. So initially we're going to make the server, all right? And then we'll start writing the HTML pages. We're going to initially write our HTML the traditional way, where we're actually going to have 3 different HTML files that will load in, right? And it'll load up those pages individually. And then what we're going to do is we're going to set it up so that we'll make it what's considered a single page app, where instead of loading the separate page, it'll actually do a HTTP request. It'll get the contents of the HTML from that file, and then it'll insert that into the DOM, right? And the way that we're going to do that is we're actually going to set up a tag that doesn't have any content of its own with an ID, and we'll set the ID to content, and then we'll actually use that same get element by ID method in order to inject our content into there. So that'll be what will be the dynamic portion of the page.
It's taking some time.
That might be a good moment for a bathroom break if anybody needs to go. You guys want to take a quick break?
Yeah, that's a good idea.
All right. Be back in about 5 minutes.
Hey, BJ. I have a quick question. Maybe I missed. You might have explained it earlier, but I missed it. So, why there are 2 servers? No, he showed me that HTML, the
Right.
front end stored on one side, and all the dynamic information stored on the other server. It's for security reasons or something else.
No, it's more stylistic than anything,
Okay.
and from a code complexity kind of separation of responsibility, so to speak.
Okay.
Most of the time, like the first server is really responsible for your API, that JSON and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
The stuff that we went over, in office hours, but also in last week. The
Mm-hmm.
vehicle data and everything. That's the API.
Yeah.
Um, and then the reason you separate it out to the front end as a separate
Mm-hmm.
server is
Mm-hmm.
because it has one function, and that single function is to return HTML.
Okay.
JavaScript, and CSS.
Mm-hmm.
So, from a content type perspective, error handling and all those different things, it's much
Mm-hmm.
easier to say, look, I'm separating out my servers. So
Mm-hmm.
this server that's doing all the API work, it is
Mm-hmm.
only speaking JSON. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
Like I don't have to
Mm-hmm.
worry about different things and set up special routes to enter HTML. And if the
Mm-hmm.
client gets confused and hits the HTML to accept JSON, it'll screw them up potentially. So
Mm-hmm.
it's just as easy to separate out, run two servers. Oftentimes, from a deployment perspective, which we'll go over a number of weeks later, is how we actually do our subdomains. Because you can
Okay.
think about like from our subdomains. So if you have like example.com, right? You might
Mm-hmm.
do api.example.com, and you'll point that to your API that's speaking your JSON, and then you might
Okay.
actually just do example.com for your website for the
Okay.
HTML, right, for the front end, or dashboard.example.com or my.example.com. At that point, it's much easier to handle that separately in
Okay.
two separate servers because the needs are a lot different. Caching's different,
Mm-hmm.
availability is different, scaling is different. You probably don't need to scale your front end as much as your
Mm-hmm.
your other side, and so separating those gives you a lot more flexibility in terms of cost management, complexity, and
Mm-hmm.
that kind of thing. Security, kind of, but you're probably gonna have the same security on both,
Mm-hmm.
so it's not really that much of a concern. Um, but typically, an HTML site, there's very little that you can do with it. So you're basically getting HTML to display, and that's about it.
Mm-hmm.
So separating those kind of give you a little bit less exposure.
Okay.
But yeah, there's a number of different reasons for what I
Okay.
just kind of mentioned.
So you have to provide two ports for the same
Um,
application?
Uh, Correct. If you're running them from the same machine, you
Okay.
do have to. They do have to run on two different ports, and then
Ports.
you use what we call a reverse proxy to
Okay.
split between them to separate. So yeah,
Okay.
so JC will use a separate port in order to
Mm-hmm.
display his front end rather
Okay.
than the port for his back end.
Okay.
Um, Definitely. So from
Mm-hmm.
that perspective, yes,
Okay.
two different ports. In reality, when you're actually deploying them,
Mm-hmm.
it's typically you're going to do them on different VMs or different containers or those types of
Mm-hmm.
things, and so they'll both be run on the same port, but they'll be
Okay.
in totally separate computers.
Okay.
But yes, to your problem earlier today, right?
Yes.
Yes, they will have to run on two separate ports. You can't run them on both.
Okay.
If you absolutely need them on the same port for
Mm-hmm.
whatever reason, then you would have to serve your HTML and JSON and CSS out of the same backend, the same server as you're doing your JSON, which you see.
Okay.
I mean, it's not uncommon. Um,
Okay.
Sometimes you'll see that.
Okay.
We just typically don't, because we feel like it's better from a systems perspective to separate those.
Mm-hmm.
Easier to think
Okay.
about, easier to maintain. Different teams typically maintain both, either one. Your deployments totally different kind of strategy on either one.
Okay.
Less frequent on one than the other, stuff like that. No reason to deploy both if you don't need to, kind of thing.
Okay. I have to go and look your networking video one more time because I thought I understand, but after this, no, I have to go back one more time.
Oh, and I'm glad you're doing that. I mean, that's that
Yeah.
it takes some time to, and it takes some
Mm-hmm.
experience, right? You got to
Okay.
experience it sometimes
Mm-hmm.
to really get it. So
Okay.
I'm glad you're going through and
Mm-hmm.
fighting the good fight
Mm-hmm.
on getting that stuff, running into those problems because that's where you really learn it.
Thanks.
And then next week is kind of it's kind of a, I'll call it a break week.
Mm-hmm.
Not so much, not really break, and we'll learn new stuff, but we
Mm-hmm.
won't do like the massive breakneck speed of, hey, this is a whole back end, here's a whole front end, right?
Mm-hmm.
We'll start diving deep into both things to look at API schemas, and we'll look at a few things along that line. Spend some time with security,
Mm-hmm.
and stuff like that, where we kind of get into the details of some of these
Okay.
things. I think it'll be a little bit slower pace and
Okay.
nicer to kind of take a step
That
back.
helps.
Yeah, these initial classes are pretty intense, right? I mean,
Yeah.
like that initial slide, we were looking at all the stuff we've done just up to this point in the first 2 weeks, right? And we're throwing a whole bunch. I mean, and front end is a whole monster in and of itself. So yeah, this will it's drinking from the fire hose right now, but here soon you'll start to, you know, we'll be gradually introducing less and less, and it'll be getting more. It will be, well, you know, that T, right? So it'll be less breadth at this point, more depth.
Okay.
Yeah, and get more experiential, and you'll it's
Mhm.
consistency, right, and
Mhm.
constant kind of exposure.
All right. So sorry that took so long to load, but finally we're in now. I think Zoom is bringing my computer down to its knees. All right, so if anybody recalls, the first thing that we're going to do is set up the actual Express server to serve up our front end, right? So in order to do that, we're going to make an index.js file in here. And then we need to navigate into the folder I'm in. So I'm in projects, and I got one here called week 3 live that we'll upload after. And then I'm going to go into this folder I made called frontend basic, right? That's where this index.js file is located. We want to make an npm project, so we run npm init. And we're just going to accept all the defaults here, right? And that made our package.json file. So what we want to do is install. The first thing we're going to install is Express. So npm install Express.
Is there advantage to using yarn over npm, or they kind of are? You have been, I mean, it's similar
It
package
it
manager, but
it used to be that there was an advantage to using Yarn because of they did some more their better versioning on their package locks and stuff. NPM recently updated in probably the last year and a half to that same type of strategy. Now they're pretty much the same. But for the longest time, Yarn provided a little bit more integrity in terms of its dependency management, which is why you see everyone use it. And now it's really kind of a holdover. In fact, I think Facebook has even kind of come out and said, "Yeah, we're going back to NPM," because they finally kind of caught up. Because as Facebook who created Yarn um, as a package manager to try to fix some of the inadequacies of NPM. But now that NPM's kind of caught up with the feature sets of those, everyone's kind of going back to NPM and using that. So no, not really any difference. You'll see us switch back and forth. I tend to like NPM better than Yarn, um, but I think I taught Yarn in the first boot camp, which is why JC uses it. So it's really just a matter where you come from.
Yeah, and it all depends on like essentially what's considered uh, like what's your team using, right? Like if you get into a project, you'll notice this package lock.json file. So if I open up a project and I see the package lock file, I know that person's using npm. But you'll see another one, for example, yarn.lock. If you see that file in there, you'll know that the person working on that particular project is using Yarn. So that's like an indication, essentially, you know, which package manager you're kind of wanting to follow, right? If you start new, it's just whatever one you prefer. So to get started, we just installed Express, so we can get a reference to Express here, right? Use our require statement. So no different than week 2. Another package that we're going to use, this comes default with Node, is called Path. And what this is for is this is just to manage the differences that you have between operating systems and whatnot for setting up path names. Like you have backward slashes or forward slashes, that kind of stuff. We need to instantiate our Express app. Right? And then I'm going to make a variable called frontend directory, right? And we're going to put that in a folder called public. So let's go ahead and make that folder in here. So underneath the frontend basic, if you look, we've got our node modules index, package lock, and package JSON. So we'll make a file or a folder called public. And this is where all of our HTML, CSS, and JavaScript is going to go. And in my case tonight, it's just going to be HTML and JavaScript, right? So here's the public folder that's been made. And then what we want to do, what's really nice about Express is we can say app.use, and Express comes with a static server. And static just means that you're serving up an actual HTML file that is just statically written there, right? And then we'll say path resolve 2 underscores dir name. This is something that comes from Node as well. Underscore dir name will resolve to whatever directory the particular index.js file is in, right? And let me actually run that just to show you guys. I'll console log this. Right, so if I run node and I run this index.js file, you'll see that's the equivalent of if I run pwd here, right? So it's so that you get a handle to whatever directory you happen to be running in. Since we're serving them static files, you need to know where those files are located. All right, so resolve dir name, and then we'll concatenate that with the front end directory here, right? So we know that we want it to be here and then the public folder that's located there. So serve up statically anything that's located in. And now we're going to say app.get and pass in an asterisk. And this is just for any gets that come in, right? It could be whatever the route is. It knows any of those. I want to throw them to this handler, right? And we'll pass in our recres function handler here. And then our response will be to send a file. And we'll use path again, resolve, dir name, front end directory, and then what we're going to put in there is going to be an index.html file. So let's go ahead and just make that file inside of our public directory here. Right, so I'm going to cd into the public directory and use touch to make an index.html file. And you should see that pop up now in here. All right, and we'll fill that in a little bit later, starting with what we did earlier in the class. The next thing we do, and this is the last thing, is we want to start up the server. So we'll say app.listen. I'm just going to say port 3000 here. That's what we're going to run the server on. And then our callback function is just going to log the front end is being served up on port 3000. All right. So that's literally all we need to serve up the front end.
Same thing we did last week, right? Pretty much. The only difference is we're serving up HTML and JavaScript rather than JSON files.
And if I run this now, node, sorry, let me go back up one level. Node index. You see the comment here, the front is being served up on port 3000. If I open up a web browser and I go to localhost 3000, you're not going to see anything because we don't have any content in that index.html file yet, right? So let's grab what we had here, this HTML example, right? I'm just going to copy and paste everything from here for our starting point. All right, and then let's see. Our title, that's what goes up into the tab. I'm going to call this FSSE front end, right? Get rid of these tags here. We'll start off with the H1. And I'm just going to get rid of this ID tag. We don't need that. We'll call this full stack systems engineering viewer. All right, so now we actually have an HTML page. So if we go back here, let's restart our server. Oh, it's making a liar out of me. You see what I'm doing wrong, BJ?
I was not paying attention, sorry. Yeah, go back to your server. recres.get. Yeah, that should do it. So you should just be able to hit 3000.
Well, let's try to load up index.html.
Oh, are you exposing 3000 in your container or your Docker Compose?
Oh, that's what happened. It's not available, and that's exactly what happened. There we go. So I've got all of these packages like npm and whatnot installed locally on my machine. So I'm gonna continue from this point just using my machine, but all of the different commands that I'm going to be using are available within the dev environment, just so that we don't have to wait on me re-entering into the dev environment here if this takes a while.
It should actually restart pretty quick because you don't have to actually do the restart and everything. You don't have to rebuild the container. Just it should open really quick because really it's the exact same thing. It's just a re-exposure of a port.
Yeah, you know what happened recently? I did some builds of our dev environment images and put them up into some registries. In order to do that, I ended up actually wiping all the different images out of my Docker installation.
Mm.
So it probably, when opening up this dev environment, had to rebuild quite a few of like different volumes and whatnot.
Yeah, it should be relatively quick there because you're really not changing anything except exposing a port, so no rebuild necessary. Well, who would have thought extensions would take a long time to install?
Mm-hmm. No, I think this is progressing a little bit better than it was.
No, it's definitely going to be faster, but now's your time to ask a question if you got one.
Yeah, we got a minute. How's the pace right now? I mean, are you guys able to follow along, or is it going too fast, too slow?
I'm catching up a little bit, but still behind
Right.
though. But the recording really helps to go back and look back everything.
Yeah, I find it takes me about a little bit longer to actually go back through the lecture and like the class, and actually because I can pause it then and actually try and walk through the example. So the recording to me is, I don't catch everything that you say during the class, but if I watch it once and then I go back and watch it again and try and follow along while you're doing it, I can pause you. That helps a lot.
That is true. Yeah.
It's true. Yeah, I'm doing the same.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. I mean, there are a lot of nuances to it which you guys share, which kind of passes over when we are seeing it live, but when you are, you kind of come to know why you did it.
Good. It's by design.
Every 5 minutes, Google search. Every 5 minutes.
That's Stack Overflow, right? Yep. Google search it. Exactly. That's the dirty little secret of every software developer. Every good one, every experienced one. So a good interview question, if you're ever hiring a software engineer or someone who's coding, ask them how much time do they spend on a Stack Overflow or Googling? And they'll think it's a trick question. They'll say, oh, I don't spend any time. Like, I know the language, great. And you know that they're just full of it. Or they're not mature enough as a developer. Because even the best developers spend more time on Stack Overflow than the junior devs.
So what should the ratio of actual coding time versus Stack Overflow be?
I don't know. I'd say it depends on the project, of course, but I don't know, 50-50? 60-40?
So I'm doing all right. I'm not too far off of that.
No, you're not too far off. No, I mean you spend a lot of time, um, and you get good at searching for things. So you end up doing a lot more reading because you end up as an experienced developer, you'll an engineer, you'll start to kind of go down the rat hole of, oh, why did they do that way? Oh, I'm interested in that. And you go down and then you figure out different ways to do things and structure. And so you may have to go back and re-architect something because it's like, oh, that's a much better way to do it. And so you kind of get down the rat hole of things in it, which is a good thing. So that's kind of why you end up spending a lot more time doing it than coding.
All right, so we finally got through, right? This is the header that we put in. And the next thing we're gonna add here is just a menu. And then we'll put a div in place. As a div is like just kind of a default tag, right? And we'll put that in place with the ID of content. That way that we can actually inject some other pages in here, all right? So let's go back to our index.html. And underneath the h1 tag, we'll put a UL tag. UL stands for unordered list, right? And then inside of the unordered list tag, you can put list items. So that's typically how a menu is created. You have either an ordered, unordered list, right? And then you're gonna have different list items of your menu items there. And then our list items are actually going to be A tags that we'll put inside of those, right? And then our inside A tags will have a home. And I'm just going to copy and paste this line. And we're also going to have a vehicles. All right. So if I refresh this page, we should see these two options. We haven't assigned any values to those hrefs so they won't take us anywhere yet. But the next thing that we're going to add is a div tag so that we can inject into there. Right. So I'm going to put it's div for div. And then we don't actually put anything in here. We're just going to give it an ID and call it content. All right, we'll see where that comes in later. Now this is, since there's no content in it, you're not going to be able to actually see this on the page, right? If you open up the dev tools, and you look at elements here, scroll down, you can open up the unordered list, and you see this div here, right? It's pretty much just has no dimensions, right? Because it has no content. So let's go ahead. We're going to make a home page and we're going to make our vehicles page. All right. So inside of this publics folder, I'll add home.html. And inside of this, since this is going to be getting loaded onto our page dynamically at some point, we don't actually have to go through and write, our doc type and everything else, right? So I'll just put a div in here. And I'm going to give this a class. I'll call it main. Classes for HTML is another way of kind of putting identifiers in for your tags. So an ID, you notice I used ID on the other case. An ID, it has to be unique, right? You are not allowed to have more than one tag with the same ID. Whereas classes can actually be shared among many tags. And then when you use CSS to target those classes, you can, for example, if you wanted an alert class, and you can actually go in and put some kind of a red hue to all of the different tags that are that have that as a class. And you can put multiple classes on a tag, but this is just to give you an idea of what this means, right? And then in here, we're going to put an H2 tag. I'm going to call that welcome home. And then the next tag for P is, this is a viewer site for the FSSE vehicle simulator. All right. Now we're going to make one other HTML file, which is going to be vehicles.html. And this one's pretty simple. I'm just going to make it a div. Inside of that div, I'll put an H2. I'm going to say vehicle list. And you might ask, well, where are the vehicles? Well, that's where the JavaScript's going to come. We're actually going to load the vehicles up from our backend and then render them, right? But we're going to use JavaScript to take that data and actually manipulate the DOM and then put those tags in there based on what we get from the vehicles. And in order for us to target this, I'm going to put an ID on this div, and I'm going to call it the vehicles container. All right. So now that we have those defined, I can come back to this index.html. We'll add these hrefs. So I'll call this home.html, right? And this is going to be vehicles.html. So let's go ahead and load this page back up, refresh. Nothing really changed. If I click home here, you'll see it loads up the tag we put in, welcome home. And I say this is a viewer site, right? That was the P tag that was in there. I can press the back button, and then I can load up vehicles, and it's just a vehicles list H2 tag with nothing else. This isn't really what we want though. What we want here is we want those that content to be injected here at the bottom, like we saw in that demo, right? And that's where that div tag that we put in the index.html file is going to come in, right? So the next thing that we need to do is we actually need to start writing our JavaScript, okay? So inside of this public folder, I'm going to make a file and just call it script.js, all right? And then on our index.html, what we're going to do is we're actually going to, inside of the header, we're called whatever's in the header isn't, you don't see it, right? We'll make a script tag. And inside of that script tag, we say src for the source, and we're just going to load up script.js, right? You could technically not do this. Like you could just get rid of source here and then just start writing JavaScript like console log hello world here, right? And if I loaded this up, it'll run the JavaScript, and you should see in the console hello world pop up. But that can get pretty messy pretty quickly. So one of the nice things to do is just to load it in as a source, and then you've got a complete separate file that you can import, right? And you can actually use these types of imports to load JavaScript files from other places on the web, right? So we'll load this back up. All right, so this is our JavaScript environment. Now this is JavaScript is actually going to be running in the browser. And one of the first things that we want to do is we want to be able to implement what's called a load page command, right? And we need to write a function for that, okay? So I'm going to create a function, and I'm going to call it load page. And in that load page, I'll provide a URL, right? And I will also provide a URL path name, okay? And this is very specific to our page, because what we're going to do is I'm going to grab the content element. We're going to use the good old document.get element by ID. Remember, we were using that in the console before. And the ID here, we specify this called content, right? And the next thing that I'm going to use, if you look through the web API options, you can see it all available on that MDM documentation reference page. There's another function that's available in the browser called fetch. All right, and what does fetch do? Fetch will actually create HTTP requests. So what we're going to do is when this function gets called, we're going to fetch whatever is at that URL, and we're actually going to inject it into that div ID, right? So what I'm going to do here is going to be a little bit odd. BJ, did we ever get a chance to talk about promises? Because we're about to start using them.
Yeah, we did in the office hours. I went through the whole shindig on how promises work. So these guys are experts now.
Awesome.
Pure
All right.
experts.
So let's do this. So this function is going to go ahead and return what comes back from fetch. We'll call fetch, and we'll feed it the URL. Right now, this fetch function that's actually available in the browser. It returns a promise, and to be able to use what's in that promise, promises have what's called a then method. Right. So now what we're doing is we're calling then on the promise that's returned. Now, what you pass into then is a callback function, and what you get is a response that gets fed into that callback function. So if this fetch succeeds, it'll feed the HTTP response into this first argument. So that's how we can access it. And then what we're going to do is we're going to return the response.text, because we need to, the response comes in, but we actually need to essentially
It comes in as a byte stream, and then you have to convert that byte stream to something, and in this case, text.
Right. So it needs to accumulate, right? That byte stream's coming in, and when you call this text method, it's allowing that to accumulate, right, into another variable, which it itself is a promise, right? And the nice thing is with promises, you can chain them. So what we're doing is inside of this, inside of the then function of a promise, we're actually returning another promise. And what gets returned there will get fed into the following callback, right? So now what we have in here is data, which is what gets resolved if this response.text call is successful. And so here's where we're actually going to inject it. So you recall we've got our content element here. So we're going to take our content element, and then we're going to call its inner HTML. So this puts HTML inside of that element, right? And we're just going to set it equal to data, because what we're going to fetch are the contents of these pages: home, right, and vehicles.
So guys, just to refer back to what we did on Tuesday at the office hours, on line 4 there, you got return response.text. Remember, we were doing the response.json because we were actually getting JSON. In this case, he wants the text being the HTML text. So it's the exact same thing there. In fact, he's using fetch, which just happens to be built into the browser here. We called that requests before, remember, but it's the same library. We just happen to be using node fetch, which is the node version of it. We're now on the front end, so we're using the fetch version that's built into every browser, most browsers.
All right. So the other API method you guys might remember was the window history to actually modify the URL. So what we want to do is that as soon as we load one of those pages, we want to update the actual URL to represent that we're on that part of the page, right? So we'll use window.history, and we'll push state. We don't really care about the state that's getting pushed, but what we want to do is we want to modify the URL path name. And this is here where we'll actually pass in the second argument to this load page function, which is URL path name, right? And once we've done that, we can return data. And this is just for error handling. So we can say, all right, you have to catch in case anything goes wrong during this fetch process, right? Maybe you can't resolve your response.text, or maybe you give it a bad URL, or the server that you're trying to locate this resource at's not working at the moment. Whatever that happens to be the case, that's where we'll handle that in this catch. So catch will receive an error, and then what we'll do is we'll give it a console log. We'll just say it failed to fetch, and then I'll also console log the error here. So we'll feed it in an object with error as a field, and then just put error right there, right? And this will just show up in the console on your browser. All right, so we have that function, right? The next function that we're going to make is going to be a main function. And what we want to do is with this main function, we're going to, as soon as the page loads and it's ready, we want to call this main function. So we'll do the invocation of that function here in a second. But what we want to do is we want to go ahead and grab the base URL. And we can get that from window.location.origin, right? If I come in here, I can show you window.location. It's got all kinds of different fields on it, right? But if you look at origin, origin just says, all right, I know that I'm here at HTTP localhost 3000, right? So if you type window.location.origin, that's what pops up, right? So we're just storing what that base URL is. That way we can actually get the full URL to the page. And then what we'll do is to start off, we'll load our home page, right? So feed in the base URL, and then home.html. And what we want to do is we want to pass in home into our URL, right? But this won't run yet because these are just function declarations. So the next thing that we need to do is we actually need to set this thing up so that it'll get called. But you don't want to call it too soon. You need to wait until DOM is ready, because if you call this right away, it would try to grab this content element, which might not exist yet, right? And so there is a nice thing available on document called ready state. So you can look at document, and it's the property is called ready state. And we want to make sure that its ready state is complete. And if that's true, we'll call main, all right? So that's if the pay is already there, right? And you maybe it's cached or something, and it's already there, it's already complete by the time this JavaScript file gets loaded, then it'll just call main right away. But in the other case, what we have to do is we actually have to register an event listener. So we can say document, and the document itself can have an event listener. So we'll say add event listener, and the event that we want to look for is called DOM content loaded. And that means that the full DOM has gotten loaded, right? And it's ready to call. And we'll pass main in here, and this just says, once you have loaded the DOM, go ahead and call main. Okay? So this should already modify what we're seeing on the page, right? When this calls, it's going to call main, and what main does is main is going to inject that home.html into our div tag that has content for its ID. So when I refresh this, you can already see welcome home's available there, right? All right. So now I think it's time that we actually update our backend a little bit. Because what we need to do is we need to set up our page to be able to load the vehicles, but we need to update the backend to be able to provide all the different data that I was shown before, like color and whatnot. All right. So we can go ahead and close these files down. I'm going to open up, this is the cloud folder. So this is our backend file here, right? Let's see what we need to add. All right, so I'm going to open up I'll close this server down for now. Come back up, go into the cloud folder. All right, and so one package that we're going to need to install is called CORS. All right, what is CORS? CORS stands for cross-origin request. Is that correct? And so, yeah, cross-origin request, you have to enable this on your server, because if you recall the architecture that we're using, we've got one server that's acting as the data access layer, right? And we have another server that's serving up the front end. Well, the server that gives you the front end app, that's the original origin. And when you have JavaScript running in your page that's going to another server, that server knows that it wasn't the origin of that page, and it'll reject your requests if that server does not have CORS enabled. So I hope I explained that correctly.
Yeah, it's cross-origin resource sharing is actually what it's is what it stands for, and the reason it's in place is for security reasons, because you can imagine that it goes along with that idea of losing control over your code client side when it goes to your browser. So you lose control over that. So if someone has a plugin that's malicious or something, they can inject JavaScript onto your page without you knowing it. And so a way to protect against that is that the browser makers have built in is to introduce this restriction of disallowing any kind of JavaScript on a page to contact any server at once. Because as you can imagine, if someone injected JavaScript onto your page, they could collect information from that page as you're typing passwords in, things like that, and then send it to another server without you even knowing. It all happens under the hood. And so if you don't intend for that to happen, then you can the CORS kind of stops that by default. So we disable that. There are other ways to protect against it, which we do. But that's one of the main reasons why CORS, cross-origin resource sharing, exists, is to really protect and sandbox that kind of critical piece of the out of control aspects of your client side code.
Right. So by default, that's disabled. And so this package that we just installed and what we're going to put in here on the back end is to enable that type of behavior, right? And you can get more specific with it and say, I only am going to allow these other origins to send me requests, but we're just going to open up the floodgates for the moment. So we're going to say constant CORS, loaded up requires CORS, right? And then in order to use it, under here we have app.use, and we'll just invoke CORS. All right. Now I'm going to do a couple things. One of the things I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to empty out this vehicles object. We're still going to use an in-memory database, but what we're going to do is we're actually going to use our Python client to load up vehicles, right? And you'll see why this is useful because we'll be able to start loading up as many as we want, and we can render 9 different vehicles, right? And so we'll go ahead and make this a little bit more dynamic here. Now on the post, this doesn't need to, well, actually, let's change one thing here. Vehicles ID, we want to include a little bit more information than just the VIN and more of this data. So there's going to be information coming in on the request body. So what I want to do here is I want to invoke this spread operator. And all this does is this takes all of the different fields that you have that are coming in, like make, model, year, etc., and it will add them to this particular object that's getting stored at vehicles ID, right? And so that's good there. Our get vehicles ID is fine. What we do want, and this is what we need for our front end to work, is we want to be able to get a list of all the vehicles. So I'm going to make an app.get, provide vehicles here, pass in recres, and then I'm going to grab the vehicles list off of this vehicles object in memory here. And I'm going to use something called object.keys. Let me show you guys how object.keys works really quick. So let's say I have an object called a car, right? And it's got a color red, right? It's got a VIN of VIN 123, and maybe its year is 2010, right? I can go ahead and console log that. And if I run this file I just made, object keys example, you should see VIN, color, and year. But what I what I want to be able to do is I want to be able to get a list of what the keys are on the object, so I can use what's called object.keys. Right? And then I can pass car in here. And that will return an array that gives you each key that's on that object. All right, so comment this initial console log out. And you can see here, it gives me VIN, color, and year. All right, why are we using that? Well, it has to do with the way that we're actually storing vehicles in this in-memory object. So each key is actually the ID, which is a UID, right? And what we want to return isn't we don't want to return just an object. What we're going to return is an array, right? We want to return an array of vehicles. So what we need to do is actually grab all of the keys, right? And then we will access this object one by one with those UIDs, which are the keys in this case, right? And that's defined by the way we have this post body set up here, okay? So I'm going to say the vehicles list is object keys. Right? We're grabbing all the keys off a vehicle, which are the UIDs, every UID in our database, and I'm going to map, and it's going to take an array of UIDs, and we're going to map it to an array of objects for each vehicle, right? And then inside of map, you pass the function that does the transformation, and so what we're going to return is another object, and we're going to grab. Here's a spread operator again. We're going to grab everything off of vehicles for that particular key. So that grabs that vehicle, right? But there's one other thing I want in my objects, because if you look at the way we're storing this, we don't actually have the ID in our vehicles. So I need to provide the UID here, right? So the UID, which is that ID, is just the key. All right. So this gives me a list of vehicles, and then I'll just return it. You know what I'll do here? I'll change this here to ID, just stay consistent. Right, just knowing that that's a UID. So this next one here, this is posting data for that particular vehicle. This is fine, we don't need to update that. What we do want though, and this is what we'll be using, if you recall in that demo example for each of the cars, we could see its velocity, the acceleration and whatnot, all updating in real time, right? And so we don't necessarily want to grab all the data, but we want at least the latest data for each vehicle. So we're going to provide a route to go ahead and just get that, right? And so we need to say vehicles, and then we'll specify which vehicle by the ID, and we can just call it latest data. Right. First thing I'll do is I'll get all the data for this particular vehicle identified by vehicle ID. And that's from our vehicles object here, right? And all we need to do is pass in the ID that we get off of rec.params. Right? And then just grab that data object off of there, right? Because we can see we've got a data field available for each of them. So that's all the data. And what I'm going to say here is if all that data is actually if that array is empty. So this is a bit of JavaScript trickery here. All data.length is the length of the number of data entries that you have, right? And what I'm saying is, if not all data.length, so if data.length is 0, not data.length is actually 1, right? So we're saying if it's an empty array, do this. That's all this means. I could just as well have said this, if all data.length equals 0. And so here we're going to return res.json, and I'll just give it a status. I'll say no data available. Right? Now, what we really want though is the latest data. Right? So what we'll do is we'll grab all data, and then since arrays in JavaScript are zero index, if you have, for example, 10 elements in your array, the very last one's number 9, right? So we want to say all data.length -1. And then we can just return that. Provide that back, latest data. All right. And so that's updated. So what did we add here? Just to recap, we added cores. That makes it so we can send requests into it, right? We updated this this post here so that we can provide more information about the car when we provision it, such as make, model, year, etc. We provided a route to be able to get a full list of all the vehicles, okay? We didn't change the post data route, but then we added another route to be able to get latest data for any individual vehicle, and that's it. But now that we don't actually have a vehicle being held in memory, how do we do it? We actually need to be able to load that up, right? So the next thing that we're going to update here, I'm just going to go ahead and save where we're at and get right now. Checkpoint. Next thing we're going to do is update this client, right? We'll set up this client. Since it can post to that, we'll actually set it up to load up a set of vehicles. Now, I'm not going to type all this out in front of you guys right now, so I'm going to copy and paste here. All right. 1 second.
JC, they come to see us type every single letter.
I really don't think you guys want me typing this.
They're missing so much content if we don't type it out specifically. Breaking our promise. No copy and pasting code.
I'm guilty then. Here we go. All right, magic. All right, so here's our vehicle list. I got it, and if you recall, we had 3 vehicles in the demo example, right? So what are the new fields that we're including? We've got our VIN, right? And these are just randomly generated VINs. I'm giving it a name. I'm just naming it after the actual headquarters location for each OEM. I've got a make. This is a Ford Focus, year 2020. Its color is blue. We're also providing the RGB values. In this case, what we're going to do here, if you recall the demo when Sumo was actually showing the cars, it can accept and encode the icons for each vehicle based off of the RGB values, right? And in this case, it encodes them from 0 to 255, right? So if you want blue RGB, that's just 0 for your red and your green channels, and then 255 for your blue. You can't go above 255, right? And then that's just 8-bit color. And then we provide an image URL, and I just found these off of Google. If I click these and open this up, you should just see the image of the car, right? And what we'll do there is we're actually going to create image tags in HTML, and we're going to inject those these images into those image tags by providing the source with this URL here, right? So that's our first car, and the data structure or the data schema for the rest of the car is the same. We've got we got Tokyo, which is our Honda Civic, and then we got Detroit, which is our Chevy Bolt. All right. Now, what we want to do, this is coming from the client, right? What we want to do is we actually want to post these vehicles to our server. So we got to update a little bit here on our client, and I'll still run this health check, right? So run health check just to make sure the server's up and running, and I'll print this out. Health check result, and just see what we get back from this health check here. Status. All right. And so the next thing what we want to do is we want to post each of these vehicles, but this is an array, so we have to iterate through the array. So I'm going to comment this out for now. And say for vehicle in vehicle list. So it's going to grab each vehicle that's in the vehicle list that was defined up here. And then what we're going to do is we'll go ahead and we'll grab the VIN, from that vehicle, since each of them has a VIN field, right? And then I'll comment here, I'll just say, all right, provisioning vehicle VIN. And let's go ahead and send that out. So this is where we want this request post here, all right? But what we want to change is we're actually going to inject that VIN in to make this a template string. But just put VIN in here, all right? But we're not posting an empty body. So if you guys recall, there's the JSON argument that you pass in. So this is going to convert this Python dictionary to JSON, and we want to pass in vehicle, right? And then I'll just print p.json for each of those, all right? So let's get this started. Let's go ahead and we're going to start up our backend. I'll say node index.js. It should be up and running on 9500, and then we'll post some vehicles to it. So I'm going to go into my client folder. Right. I need to create a virtual environment here. Then I need to activate it. And I will install everything that's from that requirements file, right? So the only thing we really need here is request, because that's the only import that we're doing. But it's just good practice to get used to installing via the requirements file in case there's just a whole list, right? That's just like your npm install. And so before we go ahead and run this and post these vehicles, let's check out that route that we wrote. So our server for the backend is running on 9500, and let's look at vehicles. And all you see here is an empty array, right? So let's go ahead and load up our vehicles. I'll just run Python main to run the client. And you can see here, the health check result was okay, which is what you see right here. And then it's provisioning each vehicle. And you can see the response gives you the vehicle ID back. So those are the UIDs that were generated by our backend. Now, if I refresh this page, you should see our 3 vehicles in here, all right? Now, I can run this again and post 3 more with the same VIN and whatnot, right? But in this case, we've got unique UIDs for each of them, right? So this is 698B4D, right? The first one's a Ford Focus. The next UID won't be 698. This is what, 3C4. So you could use this to just keep loading up more and more and more vehicles. And obviously you'd want to change the VIN since they're technically different vehicles, but just showing you what's possible here, right? So we've got that set up. And now we can get back to coding up this front end. So let's close these down.
JC, can I just ask you a question as you do that?
Sure.
So are you going through that kind of testing where you do all that kind of, where you'll put in and make sure, do you go through that normally, or are you just doing that for us? Like, would you, when you're going through and actually as a developer, do you make sure that you put in these little tests for yourself as you go through and are building something? Or is that just something you're doing for our benefit, whereas you wouldn't feel the need to do that as much?
Are you referring to like verifying that the routes are turning what you want in the browser, for example?
Yeah, that kind of stuff.
So I think it depends on the context, like and familiarity with the tool set that you're working with. And like, for example, if I'm working on just developing a backend without any concern for what's going on the front end at the moment, I typically do the tests with Mocha, right? If you recall the Mocha test runners. So we'll actually just set up the test, essentially the behavior you want, implement the route, and then run your test, and you can verify that it's all running. And that for me is very iterative. I might implement like 3 routes or so, right? But I'm constantly like adding new tests as I add the routes to confirm that they have the behavior that you want. And it's really nice because with the integration test set, as long as you define the flows correctly, you don't need to worry too much about adding some code and worrying that it broke a bunch of other stuff, because you'll see that the test won't pass. So you can test it. It a lot of times it kind of depends on the complexity for what kind of route that you're running. Like there are certain flows that are particularly complex and require that you go through multiple pages. And sometimes, nothing beats just a one-off test, like you would actually run it in a production system where you open up a page, you might input some information, open up another page, right? In particular, like single sign-on can be somewhat of a complex flow where you want to sign on with Google or something like that, right? And that's usually handled by like OAuth flow. And there could even be like a text, right? Like a text, code that gets text to you that you need to input, right? So those kind of flows you can set up the test for them, but a lot of times before you get to that point, it's almost more intuitive to do it in the natural way that you would test, right? Which is the way that a user would use the system. So that's why I'm saying it kind of depends on, it really depends on the context.
Yeah, I mean, I'll echo what JC said, but I mean, generally from my perspective is the way you solve a big problem. I mean, it goes back to this saying, and I say it all the time, is how do you eat it? How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. And a lot of people I notice, particularly developers who are starting out, don't do a good job of figuring out how to break things into smaller chunks. And that goes into system think too, where you start thinking about if I needed to solve a problem, you're not going to just go and try to solve a complex problem in one foul swoop. A lot of people do. They either cripple themselves so they can't continue because it's too complex, or they try to do something big and then they end up coding a bunch of stuff, but they never actually test anything along the way, and so they end up adding so much more time. So it's a really critical thing in my style of development to constantly be iterating, meaning I'm going to try this thing, I'm going to break it into smaller pieces, I'm going to code that. And that actually goes back to the Stack Overflow comment on Googling. Yeah, I take this tiny little piece, I'm going to set up a little test fixture for it and run it, make sure I understand what it's doing and those types of things. So it's really important to break things down to smaller problems and do that. And it tends to actually result in better functionalized code that way too, because you can reuse components because you've kind of done that and you kind of go through that. So from that perspective, for me, it does, if I'm really comfortable with a tool set, I'm really comfortable with an API, I don't test it. But most of the time, if I'm not, I'm testing every single thing that I do it. I'm running the code every time I change something to verify that it works.
Because I'm just assuming that you get to the point where we get this. So what we're doing right now is relatively simple, but I'm assuming you get to the point where you're doing this with a team and you're not doing the whole thing. You're doing, it'll say, okay, well, you're going to do the web page for the front end, but someone else is doing the other components of it. Eventually you're going to have to get these all to work. So if you don't go in and test your component of it, make sure it, but I'm just wondering if you would have things in it so that it would verify as you were integrating across people that where was the problem occurring, as opposed to,
that's where those Mocha tests come into play. What Justin,
okay,
that's really make sure. So yeah, we kind of have a strict kind of thing between us as a team, should just naturally kind of happen. Is that you don't deploy something or you don't give code to someone unless you've actually tested with a Mocha route. And if you haven't tested with a route, or with a test, then they're going to get on you about it because they just waste your time, right? So, so that's kind of the same thing with building a vehicle and everything down the manufacturing line, right? If the guys before you didn't test it or didn't do their part, you get kind of pissed at it. So yeah.
And one of the big things, if you're talking about teamwork, to be able to parallelize your efforts, right? You've got somebody working on the front end, somebody working on the back end, for example, at the same time. One of the big things, and we'll get to that in the weeks ahead, is documenting your API. And we'll actually set up schemas that validate the API that say, look, when you're posting data to this API, it actually has to adhere to this format. Like for example, when we're posting these vehicle records, right? I could set up a schema on the back end that says, look, you passed an object that doesn't have a year field on it. I'm going to reject it. I'm not even going to accept that request, right? And that creates that system contract, right, for both people to adhere to. So we'll get into that, but those kind of things really help out when you're talking about collaboration. All right, so now we can finally get back to writing our front end a little more. So we'll go ahead and open up this public folder, get into that script, okay? And I'm gonna add a couple things in here for loading the pages dynamically. We'll have that home link, right? Or the home menu item. And I don't know if I actually, let's see, did we put some IDs in here for these links? No, so we'll have to provide some IDs so that we can actually reference the links, right? So let's put, I'm gonna call this home nav link, right? We wanna be able to get this other one here. This one is just gonna be the vehicles nav link.
I like declaring variables for your different tags.
I'm sorry?
I was just describing the IDs, what the IDs were doing. You're kind of
Yeah.
you're naming those so you can grab them later.
Right. Yeah, we're just giving handles that you can go in and you can reference when you use that get element by ID method. That allows me to grab this specific one. Right. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to go ahead and grab this guy. This is your home link element. Right, and that's the document get element by ID. Right, and this was our, I think I called it home nav link. And then, if you recall, since it's a link, we actually do have a click event, right? So we can say home link element, and then add event listener, and I want to listen to the click event. So when that gets clicked, now I'm going to pass in a function, right? It has an event. Recall when we were writing this in the actual console, we want to prevent the default. So e.prevent default. And then the next thing that we're going to do, we're going to get a hold of the path name. So this is the home link element. And I want to grab the path name. The path name is this right here, right? Home.html. But I'm going to call this slice command. What happens here, and I'll just show this in the browser, what happens if we just console log home link element path name. All right. So let's go back up here. We'll go into our front end basic server. Load this server up on port 3000 again. All right. Come back here to port 3000. And if you look in the console, when I click home, remember I'm console logging that path name, right? When I click here, you can see it's got a / right, for home. And I don't actually want that /. So when I use slice, if I console log path name underneath, it's just getting rid of that. So I'll refresh this, click home again, and you see now I just get rid of that little / at the end. That's all that slice does. All right, and then we'll build a URL. Again, in this case, we don't actually even need it. So let's get rid of the slice. We'll just say home element path name. All right, so that's the URL we want to go to. What this is this grabbing that home, right? So this is, we're going to pass this in to our load page method. We just call load page URL, and we call it just like we called it up here, right? Home. Now the next menu item, we want to be able to click back and forth between the menu items, right? So this is the vehicles menu item. I'm going to copy and paste this since we can crib most of it. Right, instead of the home link element, we can just call this the vehicles link element. Right, the ID is going to be vehicles nav link. Right, and we don't want to put home into the URL. We actually want to put vehicles into the URL. All right, let's go ahead and check that out. So when I click here for home, nothing happens because it's already loaded. Vehicles, it loads in vehicle list. And you can see up here in the URL, it changed the URL to vehicles, right? When we click home, it changes that URL to home, right? And so what it's doing is it's grabbing that div that has content for the ID, right? And that happens in that load page function, and it's injecting the HTML that we wrote into as the inner HTML for that div, right? So now this is active, running, and we can, and the next thing that we want to do, and what made us go and do these updates on the back end, is we want to be able to load those vehicles in, right? So first off, we can use fetch to do that. So what we're going to do, we're going to write a little utility function. I'm just going to call it API get. So function API get, and then provide a route. All right, and we need to tell it what the base API is, or the API base URL, and that's going to be HTTP localhost 9500, right? And then we'll just return what we get from fetch, right? So here we pass in the base URL for the API. And I'm actually going to move this up top. That way, if you guys ever want to change the ports or whatever on the back end, you can just see it right up here up top. And then the next thing we got here is just the route. And so what we're saying is API get, and I want to get maybe vehicles, or maybe I want to get data, right? So we'll be able to reuse this depending upon what route we want to send a get request to. And then the next argument is an object, which gives you the options, right? We want to say, okay, this is going to be a get method. So you can use fetch to do posts as well. It doesn't have to just be get. So you can use any of the HTTP methods along with fetch, just define it here. And then we're going to pass in some headers. And if you recall that diagram that I showed a little bit earlier with the two different servers, we're sending text HTML from the front end server, but the back end server communicates with application JSON, which is what we'll specify here with the content type header. Right? Now, recall that this returns a promise, so we'll just say then response, right? And we want to return the JSON, so it's response.json. Right? So that's just a nice little utility function to run our API get calls. So when do we want to run this API get? Well, if you're looking at this page, we don't really have any dynamic data from the backend that we want to load in for home, but we do have it for vehicles. So the idea is we want to wait on this HTML to load in, and then we want to add in a bunch of vehicles. And if we look back at the way the HTML file was written for vehicles, it's got a div which has an ID, which is called vehicle container. So that's the ID that we actually want to reference once this is loaded, right? And so what we can do, recall that load page, it isn't of it itself returning a promise, right? And so what we can say, and this is where the asynchronous behavior JavaScript comes in. We don't simply just want to say, all right, API get here, because this could run the GET request before load page is finished, right? So what we want to do is we say load page.then, right? And we don't need anything really from this request. The reason we're doing it, what we're doing inside of then, is so that we know that they happen sequentially. We want to know that DOM got loaded, right? and then we are going to send out the request, right? And so all we do here is we're actually going to, I'll write this out a little bit more long form. We've got a function that we're going to call, we're just going to return the results from an API GET to that vehicles route. This here, this is literally the same thing as if I type in localhost 9500/vehicles to hit our backend. Right? Remember we loaded in those vehicles? That's literally what's happening right here. Okay? And then I'm returning it, and I can chain these promises. So I'll pass in another vehicle, and I'm going to call, you can call this variable whatever you want. It's this array that's getting fed in to this first argument for this then callback. And I'm just going to call it a vehicle list, because that's what that's what I'm getting back, right? It's a vehicle list. And so what I want to do is I want to get a hold of that vehicle container, right? So vehicles container, and I'm going to again use document.getElementById. And let's look at what that container name was, vehicles container. So I can actually just pass in the ID here, right? So now I have reference to that div. And what we're going to use is we're going to take this vehicle list and we're going to call for each. And what that means is that's going to actually loop through each of the vehicles in that list, right, sequentially. And I want to say for each vehicle in that list, let's make a header. So, and this is where you're going to see that manipulating the DOM becomes very verbose, right? It turns into a lot of code, and it can be kind of painful. And that's where React is really going to shine later on once we get to using React. So we're going to make a header element. Let's just call it header. So let's say document.createElement, and I'm going to make it h3, right? And then we'll set the text content of that header equal to, now remember this is the vehicle data, right? So I can grab that data. So I'll say vehicle.year, put a little hyphen in there, we'll vehicle.make, and we'll also grab the model, vehicle.model. Now this isn't on the DOM yet, so what we have to do is we use the vehicles container, and we append a child. So we're going to add this header as the next child in there, and append just puts it in as basically the last one in the list. So we'll append that header element. All right. So let's see what this looks like actually. So I'll refresh this page, right, and we'll go to vehicles. And you can see the full vehicle list. It loaded all these up, right? So when that runs, it grabs that element and appends all these children. All right, we got 6 of them. We want to load some more stuff, right? We want the ID, we want the actual image and everything else. So let's add some more content here. All right, but I want to put them inside of an unordered list. So I'm going to create a list. All right, unordered list, and then we have to append it to the vehicles container. And now we want to make our list items. So the first one we're going to make will be for the UID. I will set its text content here. We'll say this is a UID. Actually, sorry, we'll do ID here, right? And that's going to be vehicle.id. And append that to a list. And at this point, it's kind of just boilerplate. So we've got the next one we want to add. Let's go ahead and add the name. So we'll create another here. Just call the text content name and grab vehicle.name. That gets added. Copy and paste this again. All right, let's say the color. And then let's add one for the latest data. So it's going to be document, create element, make a list item as well. And then we don't have the data yet, so I'm just going to fill this in and just say latest data ... for now, right? Just go ahead and pin that. All right, let's go ahead and look back at the page just to see what we've done so far. I'll refresh this guy. Here's your home. Oh, looks like something broke here. All right, let's see what's going on. So it looks like something broke once we got to here. So I'm going to comment this out. All right, so that's back to working the way we expected it to work. So let's see.
By the way, debugging, commenting stuff out is a really good thing to do. If you're trying to get down to things, commenting works really well. Just take it back to where you thought it worked and then start, slowly stepping it in. That's what he's doing right now.
Yeah, so we're just going to walk our way down, right? All right, so the IDs are okay. That's not a problem.
I bet it has to do with that latest data item, actually.
It looks like perhaps it's this name.
I think so.
Oh. Yeah. Oh, I see what happened.
I bet. So put that back in, Justin, actually. All right, so go back to your page and then look at the console. See
Syntax.
that? Yeah. So it's actually telling you, oh, you've tried to declare item twice. So if you go back, you'll see that he did let item twice. So he declared that there, but he also declared it up on his line 63 there.
Yeah, so declaring the same variable within the same scope is a big no-no, right? That's the danger of copy and paste. Anyway, we can get rid of these lines. We should be good now. All right, home page, here's our vehicles. All right, cool. So we've got ID, which for our UID, name, color, latest data. We don't have our data yet. We still want to get our image as well, right? So let's go ahead and add our image in here. This is going to use a different tag. We'll just call it img for image. And it'll be another document.create element. img, all right? And then all images, because you don't necessarily know whether or not the link to the image is going to resolve, you provide alternate text. So what we're going to say is the text is just going to be the same as what's in the header, right? This is just what it kind of appears if the image doesn't load. And the header, if you recall, that's right here. It will show you the year, make, and model. The next value that we're going to set is the source. So this is actually that URL, and that comes from the vehicle that we returned, right? This is coming from the back end. And remember, there is a image URL field on this vehicle. So these values here, you've got your image URL, that's what's getting loaded in to that image tag now, right? And the last thing we need to do, it's not on the DOM yet, it's only been created, it's kind of floating in space. We have to add it to the vehicles container. So I'll say vehicles container append child, img. And if we reload this page, you should be able to see all our nice vehicles in here. Everybody seeing that? one thing needs to be done, that's why the page is looking a little bit weird, is I put that div inside of the unordered list. Let's take it out. All right, there we go. So this is also justified with the initial heading. It's time we load up vehicles. We're all the way left justified at the moment. All right. So we're almost there. The next thing that we want to get is vehicle data, right? Now, we're going to set up the front end to go ahead and try to fetch that data, but there's no data yet, right? We haven't actually posted data. What we're going to do is set up the code to go ahead and fetch constantly at a constant interval latest data for each of the vehicles. And then we'll update the vehicle simulation to actually go and load up data for our new backend code as well. And then we'll be able to actually see all this updating live. So if you look here, it was vehicles, and you can provide the vehicle UID, right? If you remember what the route was called, latest data, right? There's nothing in there yet, so that's why it returned that status, no data available. Once there's data available, you'll start seeing it all come in. But let's go ahead and set up this request here inside of our front end. All right. Let's go back to the script here. And where we need to do this is actually once we start loading up the vehicles. Why do we need that? Well, if you look in the URL, you need to know the ID of the vehicle in order to get its data. And you don't know that ahead of time. That's actually data that's being stored in your backend, right? And so now that we have reference to the vehicles, right, we have the ID here. So we can actually use that ID to set up the request, right? So this might get a little bit weird, but just hang with me for a second. We're going to use a function. This is also a function just like fetch, just like window, just like document, that it's available directly in your browser, and it's called set interval, right? Now set interval, what it does is it accepts a callback, right? It's a function that's going to get called at a constant interval, and we're going to define this interval at 1 second, all right? And then what we're going to do is we're going to use that API get again. And instead of just vehicles, we're going to get vehicles, right? We're going to pass in the vehicle.id, and then we're going to get the latest data, right? And once that's done, we call then. Now, technically, we should have the latest data, right? Once that resolves. So now what we can do is we can actually grab this latest data item, right? We still have reference to that element, and we can update its text. So we'll just say text content is going to equal latest data. And now I'm going to use another function that's available right into the browser. So update these guys to backticks. It's called JSON.stringify. All right. What does this do? The object that's coming in is a JavaScript object. And the only, like, a difference between a JSON object and a JavaScript object is really just some quotes. For example, when this is being rendered like in a nice way, I've got a plugin. I don't recall what the name of that plugin is. You can see here, JSON view. If any of you guys want to make the JSON look pretty when it gets returned into your browser, essentially what my screen's doing here, you can just download this JSON. No, actually, is it JSON view?
JSON viewer is what I use, but I don't know. There's a ton of them.
Yeah, let's check out the plugin. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. So you guys can check this out from the Chrome Web Store, JSON view. It'll just render these really nicely, but the actual JSON actually has some quotes around here. If you're going to write JSON, that's one of the differences between like a JavaScript object and a JSON object. And what it'll do, this JSON.stringify, it accepts a JavaScript object, and then it just converts it to JSON, which is essentially just a string, right? So we're just gonna stringify that latest data, right? Since what has to be set here for the text contents is actually a string. And then in case this fetch doesn't work, we'll just have a catch here, right? And if there's an error, I'll just console log the error. All right. Now what this is doing, recall all this is happening. I'll just say get latest data here. Notice this vehicle, all right? So we're doing this inside of a for each. So for every vehicle that comes back, we're actually setting another set interval that's going to be running it at 1 second. So if I have 6 vehicles, I'm sending 6 requests a second to the back end to try to get latest data for each of them. This is wasteful in the sense that you don't, like you could be you're constantly pulling the back end when the data hasn't necessarily updated yet, right? And later on in the weeks ahead, we'll introduce MQTT, which allows us to actually keep a socket open and allow the back end to tell us, the cloud will tell us when new data is available so that we don't do redundant, unnecessary fetches, right? But at the moment, we're just gonna constantly hit the back end, try asking for new data, right? And so let's go ahead and load this up. All right, refresh the page, go to our vehicles list, and then it gets back that exact thing that we saw here, right? No data available for any of them, right? So we're pretty much at where we were in the demo when I was showing that demo in the beginning in terms of the front end. So now what we need to do is we just need to update our vehicle simulation with Sumo in order to dynamically grab all the vehicle data. You know, it'll get a hold of those RGB coordinates as well to set the colors of the icons, and then start simulating and posting that data up. All right. So I'll close these guys down. And recall, this is all from week 2, right? So I'm just going to open up the embedded folder here, and then I'll open up that vehicle file. Okay. So some of the things that we don't need, we get our VIN from the cloud, right? So all of this I can actually comment out. All right. Still want to start up Tracy. But one of the things that we want to do now in here, we're going to get the vehicle list from the back end. All right, so I'm going to say res. Remember, we've got a reference here as cloud for the back end, right? Or is that not the case? I think we're using requests, aren't we? All right, I'll just say call it request still. .get HTTP. This is at 9500, right? And we're getting a list of all the vehicles, right? Now we need to resolve that to JSON. So this is going to be the vehicle list is res.json. And then what we want to do is we actually want to add these vehicles to our simulation, okay? So we're going to loop through all the vehicles that are available. So instead of this add vehicle here, what we're going to put in is for vehicle in vehicle list. And say I got information from the cloud. Right, I'm just going to grab the vehicle name and plug it into this 0 here, right? And then I'll call Tracy. Say Tracy.vehicle add. And then in this case, I have the vehicle ID, right? From the cloud. And I'm just going to add those to route 1. I think we might want to update this network route here. So what we got? We can get rid of this here, and I'll just add route 1. I don't think the net doesn't need added, updated. How about sumo config? No, we're good there too. All right, so that's all set. Let's go back to updating the vehicle here. So then now that we added the vehicle to Route 1, I want to update the color as well. So the way that Tracy accepts the colors is tuple, which is like a fixed length array. And it's just going to be like 3 colors, like 0, 0, 255, right? That would be RGB. This would be for blue. But we want to add those dynamically from the data. So we're going to grab those from the vehicle object, right? And the field was called color RGB. And then we grab the R channel. And then the next one is going to be vehicle, color RGB, the G channel, right? And then for the B channel. Now we can actually set the color for that vehicle. So we say Tracy vehicle set color, provide the vehicle ID, and then provide the color. And we can print out the initial speed as well for each of these vehicles. Tracy.vehicle and say get speed, vehicle ID, that particular vehicle. So this is cool. So we actually set it up so that the SUMA simulation depends on how many vehicles are in our backend right now. We can get rid of this initial vehicle add, and we'll start stepping through the simulation. So each step, we've got Tracy simulation step, but what we need to do now is we actually want to loop through each vehicle on our vehicle list to get its data. Right, and I'm gonna grab the vehicle ID for this particular vehicle. And then I'm going to grab a bunch of different data here. So we need to do a try except because once the vehicle leaves the simulation, this actually start failing. And we don't want our simulation to stop as soon as one of them leaves. Let's get speed and grab this here. That's going to get it for that vehicle ID, right? And we've got a bunch of other stuff we can get. Here, I'm going to copy and paste this. Acceleration, just called get acceleration. And I know this from actually just looking at the Python documentation for Tracy. That's why I didn't memorize these or anything like that. Get acceleration, just pass in the vehicle ID as well. The next one is going to be distance. And that's, as you can imagine, get distance. And distance would be the distance the vehicle has traveled since start of simulation. So it's like an odometer essentially. And the next one, we'll actually grab the X and Y positions. All right, so that's a good amount of data. And just so that we can kind of watch this in our console while the simulation runs, we'll say this particular vehicle has this speed. I'll grab vehicle ID and then speed. So this out here that we're going to post up to the cloud, let me indent this so we're all inside of our vehicles loop here, right? Now we can grab quite a few things. So I'm going to add a timestamp in here. If you look up top, we've got our time library imported. This just returns a Unix epoch timestamp. Have we discussed the Unix timestamp?
I don't think so. The epoch timestamp?
Yeah, the epoch timestamp. Let's check this out. So Unix epoch timestamp. The reason that this epoch timestamp is so useful, all it is it's actually the number of seconds that have passed since midnight at January 1st, 1970 in UTC time zone. So it's a huge integer. These are the number of seconds that passed since then. Why is that useful? It's useful because it's completely unambiguous as to when an event occurs, right? You don't have to have a reference to, oh, it was 10 o'clock at UTC, right? and you don't have to worry about daylight savings time, any of that, right? It is an absolute time. And there's libraries that can take Unix timestamps, which is essentially just a big integer, and resolve that to your local time. So if you're in Houston, if you're in Los Angeles, New York, Columbus, Ontario, etc., right? Any of those places, it'll grab that Unix timestamp and then resolve it relative to whatever your time zone settings are. Right, so it's really nice because it basically makes it so as systems developers, you don't have to worry about the complications because time zones are extremely difficult to deal with.
Yeah, you don't want to deal with time zones. I think Justin and I have spent an entire day before, literally 24 hours, arguing about something that had to do with scheduling a timer in a number of different things with time zones. It was awful. It really was.
Yeah, scheduling and scheduling is difficult because like if you have an app and you say I want something to happen at 6 a.m. and you don't know, does that person want it to happen 6 a.m. at that time or 6 a.m. relative to where the person is, and you have to look at the GPS. I mean, it's
awful.
Yeah, it's complicated.
So just keep things in integers. Much easier.
That's all this timestamp is. When you see that big integer coming in, you just know that that's the number of seconds that passed since midnight January 1st, 1970 UTC. So we got vehicle speed. Here's acceleration, right? Put accel in there. Distance. We got position X.
I think that was a semicolon you did there, as opposed to a colon.
Am I missing something?
Line 64, 63, it's semicolon, as opposed to.
Oh, yeah, good catch. Okay, so now we're going to post to the data for that particular vehicle, right? So grab all those channels for that particular vehicle, and for every single one of the vehicles, we're going to be loading data up. Okay? And then what I'm going to do, I'm actually going to make these vehicles stop once they get to the corner. So say current road. For this particular vehicle, get the road ID. And then if the current road is equal to top east, and you see that in this routes file here, right? Top east. And those IDs depend upon how the network file is set up, which is this net.xml file. So what we want to do is we actually want to stop it. We'll say set stop. Maybe there's a stop sign, right? Tell this particular vehicle to stop. East-south, right? And the duration of the stop is going to be 10 seconds. Just to make it a little bit more interesting. And then we're going to increment our simulation step, and we'll go ahead and sleep for half a second. And just say that we're done once we get finished with the whole simulation. Right? So those are the updates that we needed to make, and now this thing is actually going to communicate with our vehicles route that we just wrote at the back end, right? It'll set up all the vehicles, set their colors and whatnot, and send the data up, okay? So let's see this whole thing run. I'm just navigating into the client folder here, or sorry, the embedded folder here. See, let me zoom in a little bit for you guys. All right. One thing I need to do is I need to load up the Sumo GUI. The ampersand here just runs that in the background. And then we need to start up our virtual environment. This is the Sumo GUI, right? We'll start up a virtual environment. And I need to activate it. and then I'll install everything from the requirements file. So we're almost there, guys. And then we just need to talk about React, right? React isn't too bad. I think once you walk from this, you guys will like it. So now that that's there, we can fire up the simulation. Oh, sorry guys, I gotta set my Sumo home. Let's see here. Where's my Sumo home at? There. All right, so this guy is now running. Okay, so what happened here? Name error, vehicle ID is not defined. Oh, see, I spelled it wrong. Let's try that. This is line 56. There we go. Try that again. Oh, we got another error. POXY is not defined. Line 64. Shut these old ones down. All right, let's try one more time.
Spelling is hard.
Oh yeah, it is. Oh, we got another one. Get road ID. Oh, yeah. It's ID. Capital D. It's fourth time a charm. Is that the fourth time? All right, we got a blue one, a red one, and here comes our white one. Now we should see another blue one. All right. So we're running off to the races. And if we look at our front end, this guy's updating. And it knows how to get the data for each individual vehicle because it has the ID, right? And if you guys look here into the networks tab for the tools, you'll see all of these requests firing off. Right? All these latest data requests, right? And each of them are for a different UID. And you see, I could, with that initial Python client, right? When we loaded up these vehicles, we could add another 3. I mean, we could add 100 of them and have the whole thing running, right? We could have 100 little vehicles running on here. So it's a fully data-driven system, and that's really one of the benefits of setting up the architecture, separating your front end and your back end, right? The front end renders based on what's in your back end. So we got to this point, and now the question, well, if I got here, why do I need React, right? And I think one of the things is, if you notice get element by ID, you have to go in and you have to specify every one of those elements and you completely unique IDs, which is fine because this is a fairly small example, right? But imagine that you've got a very complex front end with thousands of elements in it. And you have to come up with unique IDs for every single one of them, right? And that's just one of the difficulties that you can run into. React makes it so you don't have to worry about those things. It can do local scoping, actually generates IDs for you. Once I start introducing React a little bit more, there's lots of benefits. So we'll start talking there. React in general, just in a nutshell, will make your front end more scalable, right? For more complex systems and whatnot. And it's more efficient in terms of the way it manipulates the DOM. It has the concept, what's called a virtual DOM. It just looks at differences in terms of what needs to be on the page, and it only updates what needs to be updated. Whereas doing it this way, you can end up re-rendering things redundantly, right? So let's I'll shut this down for now. And what we are going to do is we're going to re-implement the same front end that we just had with React. But I want to give a little bit of an introduction to React first. So I'll shut these servers down, right? As soon as I shut this node server down, you can see all these GET requests that came in, right? This is our backend, lots of them. As soon as I shut this down, we're going to lose all those vehicles since they're being kept in memory. All right, so we got that front end server coded. Let's talk about React. You guys got any questions? All right, let's go ahead. So JavaScript's, it's asynchronous, but let's be a little bit asynchronous ourselves and launch Create React App. So Create React App is it's a package that's put together. It's available on NPM. We're going to use something called NPX that actually fetches that package on the fly. And we're going to create a front end, and we're just going to call it front end React. The reason I'm going to have, if anybody's following along, have you do this right now is because this can take a while. So I'll have this run while I'm talking about React a little bit. So I'm going to come out here, and we've got our list of folders, right? We're going to say npx create React app, and I will call it this front end React.
NPX, not NPM.
There we go. So let this guy run. It'll take a while. Let's talk about React. So what is React? It is a JavaScript library framework for building user interfaces, and we've talked a little bit about single page web applications, right? And what that is, right, is where you don't actually load a full different HTML page every time you're navigating through the app. The content's rendered dynamically. And that's React really specializes in that. It comes with a virtual DOM to optimize rendering speed. So you've got, if you recall, you've got the actual DOM that's in memory in your browser. And what React does is it keeps track of a full virtual DOM in parallel. And it has that in memory. It does comparisons between what's on the real DOM and what's in its virtual DOM. And when you go to change things on the page, it will first change that virtual DOM, which doesn't get rendered right away, and then look at the differences between that virtual DOM and what's on the real DOM in the browser. And those differences are the only things that it updates, which really helps out with rendering speed and efficiency, right? That's a huge perk for using React. What we talked about before when we were looking at the web API, like get element by ID, set event listener, all that kind of stuff, this provides cross-browser compatibility. And when you're talking about, it's not 100% effective. We do run into issues where something might not work on Safari, but at least gets you, 90% the way there in terms of using, like, translating a certain web API command into what's equivalent for Internet Explorer, or what's equivalent for Safari or Chrome or Firefox or any of the other browsers. Now, just a bit of history. This is initially released by Facebook in 2013, but don't let that scare you or anything. It's open source code and it's on the MIT license. So correct me if I'm wrong, BJ, but I don't think you're ever going to run into Facebook trying to charge royalties to you when you create a site in React, right?
I don't know.
Maybe.
I think they did that right there just last year. There was a big to-do, a couple years ago now, big to-do about how they licensed it. It wasn't completely open source license, or it was open source license. And they basically were acting like it was completely open source, but they had some Creative Commons issues with the licensing. So people were questioning Facebook's motives with it, and they immediately, within a week of all that coming out, they changed it to an MIT license. So yeah, their intentions are pretty clear. They don't really have any I don't think, intentions of charging licenses or anything for it.
All right, so rest assured, it's a really good framework. We use it all the time, and as you can see, I mean, there's some really large companies that use React for their front ends, right? If you're familiar with Netflix, right? You go into Netflix, you should see if you can actually install like a little plugin into your browser. If you see my browser here, I've got like a little icon for React. And if you install this, this will just light up as soon as you navigate to a website that's been created with React. This guy will light up blue. And you can click here. It'll say, "Oh, this page is using a production builder React." So you can. It's kind of interesting. I was on a USCIS website recently, and even the U.S. government for some of their websites, they're using React as an example. So I mean, it literally is all over the place. Not saying that's a great example in terms of design, but it's just to let you know how ubiquitous it is at this point.
There's a few other frameworks that you'll hear a lot about, especially in enterprise. Angular, you'll hear a significant amount. It was developed by Google. It's kind of going out of style, at least for new development. It will always be around because there's a significant amount of legacy development, but you don't see a ton of that. Most people are switching to React now. And then you'll hear things like Vue.js, which is similar to React. It's just a lot less adopted. And then there's the older frameworks like Ember and Backbone and others that are similar. I would maybe lump jQuery in there, but not really. So you'll hear about things, but really it's the two major ones are Angular and React. React is by far taking the world by storm.
So let's move on a little bit, talk some more about React. So React has kind of its own paradigm in terms of how it wants you to build websites, and it's a component-based perspective on building your websites. For example, if you look at Netflix, you want to imagine this as a set of components, and it's very powerful because it enables like very good code reuse, right? When you're talking about setting up your web page, you define a component, right? And you can re-render that component with different content, and it'll adapt to that. And to give you an idea, if looking at this page, you could have up top here for Netflix would be your nav component, right? You've got different menu items, your home, TV shows, movies. They tend to use the big image, right? That's up top, depending on whatever is the featured show or film for that day, is usually called the hero component. And then you can see you've got a category component, and inside of that, all these like series or movie components, right? And you can see it based on what the title is. It would render differently, right? Different images and whatnot. So that's just a high level view of what components are. And then here's kind of an under the hood view of how React works, right? So you're going to build up your React components, right? And then you're going to feed that in. You don't really have to do this when you use Create React App, which is running right now to bootstrap the whole thing. But under the hood, React uses Babel and Webpack, and it needs Babel because what you're going to see with React is this JSX syntax, which is like a mixture of HTML and JavaScript, right? And it can transpile that over into vanilla JavaScript. And then Webpack will take all that code and it bundles it together. And what you end up with at the end is just some JS, CSS, HTML files. Depending upon the system, you could just get one bundle.js, but I've also seen builds where it chunks them and you have maybe like 3 different chunks. But the JavaScript that you see, and we can go ahead and do a compilation once we get this thing built up. The JavaScript you see is almost unreadable. It's minified, like all the white space has been taken out to try to optimize load times for the pages, which is really important when you've got a production site out. Talking about React, I mean, it's obviously in web pages, but it's also available on other mediums. So there's a tool set called React Native, which it's not a one-to-one trade-off with what you would see in a web page, but it is like, it's just about there. I mean, if you're comfortable building web applications, it will not take you too much time to get comfortable with React Native because it is so similar. And you can use React Native, and you're writing JavaScript, so you don't have to learn a new language, to actually create Apple and Android apps. And what they do is they have their library that's built on top of the language that are used by the native apps, like you're going to use Swift if you're making a iOS app, or you're going to use Kotlin or Android if you're, or sorry, Kotlin or Java if you're creating an Android app. And then to take it one step further, we like to use a service called Expo. And Expo is another layer on top of React Native that abstracts the differences in iOS and Android into another commonality. So you can have one code base, right? And it can run on both Android and iOS, right? And for quite a few use cases. And you can just imagine how much that helps. You don't have the maintenance of trying to keep two different apps up to date, right? I mean, it's huge simplification. And I never messed with this last one, but you can also do some virtual reality with React. I mean, it really is everywhere. Do you guys have any questions? No? All right. So now let's get to rewriting our current front end with React. Hopefully this guy's almost done. So it's still building up. You can see this folder here, front end React, right? And all these files that you're seeing here, notice that yarn lock. So create React app typically starts with yarn. So if I'm working in a React app, a lot of times I'll end up using yarn to go ahead and add modules and whatnot. So that's back to the conversation we had at the beginning. I think while this is waiting, I've actually got a build compiled here. I can show you guys.
Yeah, so if you guys go into enterprise or whatever, a lot of enterprise development's done with Angular, which is the competitor to React. And I'll keep kind of mentioning that because it's not all about React. While we use a ton of React, and I think a lot of more startup-oriented, lean, rapid development teams will use React because it's a lot lighter than Angular. You still hear a lot about Angular, a lot. So just be prepared for that. It's very similar. Angular is very frustrating in that before version 2 is very heavy of an API. After version 4 of Angular, they actually shifted. Now it looks a lot like React suddenly. And so there's, the versioning has a problem with it. And so I think that's why it's lost a lot of steam and momentum, because you have incompatibilities between versions, legacy supports, and stuff like that. So just be aware that it's not all about React, but you basically have two frameworks out there right now for new builds, and that's Angular and React. And Vue a little bit, but Vue looks exactly like React. It's just people who don't like Facebook will use Vue. Facebook development specifically.
So what ends up getting built at the very end? Here's a front end built in React, and you can compile your code. If you look at the actual package.json file that gets set up here, this has a set of scripts, and you'll see this build script. So when you run npx create React app, it'll load your system up with these React scripts that'll run build, and that'll use Babel and Webpack behind the scenes to create this build folder. And this when you're in a production system is actually what you end up serving up out to the wider web. While you're developing, there's a little dev server that'll run where you don't have to necessarily have this build, but that's all just being handled in memory. So this build folder, like I said, you're going to have HTML, right? Here's your static, and then you've got your JavaScript, right? And this one's chunked out, so you've got different JavaScript files. But if you look, I mean, it's just not even human readable. This file is absolutely huge looking, right? But it's been minified, which means they've taken out the white space, they've removed all of the returns and whatnot, and so this is what gets loaded into the site, and this has all been transpiled to use older versions of JavaScript so that it's more compatible across your browsers. But not all browsers use you know, the latest and greatest syntax, right? And so this is really what you're getting as your end result here. So when I was showing this graph back here, right? This JS, CSS, HTML, that's what you got here. And so what it does is eventually, when you look at this index.html was what it initially gets loaded, it will have an element inside of the body. Let's look through here. It should just be with an ID called app. See if we can actually find it in this minified version here. There you go. This one's called root. So it just, for your React apps, it's going to have a div element on that index.html, and it just sets the ID to root, and then it injects everything into that div element, right? And that's your entry point. And from there, it's almost all JavaScript. So let's see if we're done. Okay, just about. Yeah, this can take a while, setting up Create React App, because when you use npx, it actually loads down Create React App as well. If you're always doing this, you can actually install Create React App globally, and you just have to make sure you keep it up to date, and it'll actually bootstrap all of this a little bit more quickly.
So is that something you'd recommend, or is that something that you would say, don't worry about it for what we're going to do?
I would say it depends on the frequency that you're doing front end work, right? Like if you do it all the time, you're probably not getting out of date with the Create React app that's installed, and so you would gain time by installing it globally in your npm packages. But if you haven't built a React app in a while, then you might as well run npx, because at that point you'd have to do two steps. You'd have to, one, update the global install for Create React App, and then two, bootstrap a whole app from it, which would be the same. And by running npx, you kind of guard yourself from accidentally using an outdated version of Create React App. So it's a way of ensuring that you're getting the latest and greatest. All right, so happy hacking. Let's just see what you actually get, right? You see here, this is the front end React folder that we just built. That got bootstrapped, right? And it's got a whole list of files in here. We got a README. This README is huge. It even tells you, this project will bootstrap, will Create React App and whatnot. It installs the node modules already. You've got your package.json. And so the interesting thing is you need Node on your computer to use Create React App, right? And it's because you use Node modules to do all the compilation, even though this is a front-end system at the end of the day, right? But Webpack and Babel, those are actually being provided with Node, all right? And then we've got our public folder that got set up. Here's a source folder and our yarn.log, since this is using Yarn to manage the packages, right? And if we look in package.json, you should see under scripts. So you can add to this too. Like if you want to say npm run, whatever you want to name the script, and set up your custom scripts, it comes with 4 already: start, build, test, and eject. Unless you're really comfortable and know how to customize a Webpack configuration, do not eject. So because
don't eject, please.
Don't eject, because you cannot go back after you've ejected. So what we're going to do is we're just going to run start, right? And you can do that by just typing yarn start. And this is going to actually boot up a development server. Its default port's going to be on 3000. And it'll serve up the initial code that got bootstrapped And this is just a default of what you get when you bootstrap a React project. Right, so the development server is already starting up, and it should automatically take me to my browser and open up the front end.
You're in your development container, right?
Yeah, it might not
It may
reach
not
through.
take you directly to it, but
I don't think it's ready yet. So this is compiling. And
transpiling.
What's that?
It's transpiling.
Right. Yeah, so it's transpiling. Once it actually gets loaded up, it's pretty nice because it'll hot load. So now it's compiled successfully, and you can see it on port 3000. And every time you make changes, it'll reload the page in your browser. So this is the initial page that you get. They provide you a link that'll take you actually to the reactjs.org page, and there's plenty of tutorials in here if you're curious about some details on how to use React and whatnot. But what we're gonna do now is we're gonna take this app, right? I'm gonna strip the CSS and the styles for the time being out of it, and we're just gonna recreate what we just did with vanilla JavaScript HTML, right? So let's go ahead and get started. If we look in the public folder, check out this index.html. This is a non-minified version, so it's a little bit easier to see. Remember, we've got doc type HTML. We've got our head. That's not the viewport. What's in the viewport? We've got our body. There's a no script tag in here that just sends up an alert if somebody has JavaScript disabled because it won't be able to run the app. And then we've got our ID. This is root. So this is where the injection happens, right? Is in this ID. And if we look in source, and I think it's here in index.js, you'll see where we call document get element by ID root. And what this is doing is there's some packages called React DOM, and it'll render everything that's in here. So you guys are seeing JSX for the first time. This is JSX, right? And it's got a similar feel to HTML because you've got these greater than and less than signs, right, for your tags. And it's saying take this whole app right here, and I want you to render it into this element. So that's where that connection comes in, all right? So the first thing that I want to do is just delete some files to get rid of some noise here. So we do not need app.test. So delete. We do not need this logo anymore. We're not going to worry about having a service worker. We don't need setup test either. All right, so the only files that we're going to keep, and I'll keep these CSS files around for now once we start adding some styles. So let's go ahead and get rid of this service worker here. That's good. Get rid of this here as well. We don't need the service worker. And then in app.js, we don't need this logo. And then let's go ahead and update. So this is the initial app, right? We look into the index.js file. This is our initial file, and app is essentially what's just getting rendered. It's inside of the strict mode tag, which is affects how strict React is with its rules. But this app.js, if you look at the imports here, import app from app is in the same directory. The syntax here for imports is a little bit different than what you're used to with Node, right? So this is similar to like constant app equals requires app, right? But in the context of React, these are what the import statements look like, right? So we're loading in this app and then we're rendering it. Now, what's in here, this is what we actually saw initially on that page. One of the things that's really cool though, is when you're developing in React, it'll actually show your debug information in your browser. If you pull up your dev tools here, I mean, this debug information is in and of itself just HTML, right? But by working with React, it already comes with all the tools that you need to be able to render this in HTML and show it to you. So that can help. Sometimes the errors in React can be kind of cryptic, so you do have to get used to it. And the reason that it's hard sometimes to do the debug is just because of the translation, because what's running in your browser isn't exactly what you see with JSX, right? So the first thing that we're going to do here is just get rid of this whole header, right? And then I'm actually just going to make an H1 in here like we did before and call this full stack systems engineering viewer. All right, so that actually compiled. This is similar to what we had, but it looks a little bit different. Anybody have an idea why?
CSS?
Yep. So the CSS, I haven't removed the default CSS from this page yet, right? And you can see we're here, it's importing this app.css file. So this has got some default CSS settings. I'm not going to get rid of them, but I'm just going to comment those out from now and just not do this import. And then inside of index.js, there's also this index.css import. We'll get rid of that one. And so when I come back here, all right, so this looks a little bit more like, you know, a 90s web page. No CSS, just pure HTML default CSS. Right? And now what we're going to do is let's set up our first component. All right, so I'm gonna make a new folder in here, and I'm gonna call it lib. And inside of lib, I'm gonna create. Actually, you know what? That might not be the best thing to start with. Let's start with a screen. So I'm gonna make another folder called screens, and we're gonna make a home. So inside of screens, I'm gonna make another folder called home. And then inside of that folder, let's make a file called home.js. All right. Now, to create a React component, the first thing you need to do is always import React from React, right? And now what we're going to do is we can create a class. We're going to call it home, right? These are objects essentially, right? If any of you guys saw I think it's in the advanced JavaScript where we talked about classes and objects. A class is essentially like a blueprint for objects, and you have multiple objects for a class, right? So if you remember like that Netflix example, when you're looking at the different movies or series components, those would each be different instances of a movie or series class, for example, right? So we're going to create our home class, and you have to say it extends react.component. And this means that when you're extending, this means it inherits. So react.component is what it's inheriting a bunch of behavior from. And the one method that you always have to implement is render, right? So what does it do when you're rendering? So far, this all looks like JavaScript, right? And now we're going to, in the render function, we're going to return. And now this is where it gets weird. We're actually going to put a div in here, and it looks like HTML. And that's where what you're seeing here, this page, this is JSX, which allows you to kind of mix and match HTML and JavaScript. So we'll just have our welcome home, just like we did in the other page, right? And our p tag. We're just going to say, this is a viewer site for the FSSE vehicle simulator. All right. And now what I can do is I can actually import this home into our app. So import home from screens, home, home. And the reason I put this file in its own folder instead of just putting it right under screens is because it allows us to localize our CSS. And so we can write a little CSS file that's scoped just for that component, which is really nice because scoping in CSS is another headache, right? And React really helps you out with that. So what we can do here is actually just return this home element, right? Oh, so what you're seeing here, import error does not contain a default export. So what I need to do at the bottom here is I say export default home, right? And now we've got our H1 and our home element. Let's see what our page looks like. All right, so there's our local home. Okay. So essentially this right here is what you see for this home element. So that, the next thing that we're gonna do is, if you recall, we had our menu items, so our home and our vehicles, and I want to set this up so that we can have those, right? Now, the way you do that in React is a little bit differently. It's a little bit different. You have to set up what's called a router, all right? And so we actually need to add a package here. So I'm gonna call, I gotta navigate into the folder first. I'm gonna call yarn add, and it's gonna be React router DOM. All right, and then while that's adding, I'll just go ahead and start writing the import for it. So we're gonna import 3 things here from React router DOM. The 3 things that we want to import are switch, route, and browser router. Now, this might look a little bit weird, what you're seeing here. These curly brackets with stuff inside. This is just a shorthand way of, if I were to write something like, for example, in Node, if it was React router DOM and I did a require like this, right? Essentially, it's allowing me to do something like this. Const switch equals React router DOM dot switch, right? And then you do the same thing for route. But instead of having to have all this boilerplate here, this is just shorthand for doing exactly that. It's what you're doing is you're destructuring the object that gets returned from React router DOM, right? And so in order to use this, we have to wrap our entire app in browser router. So put this all in browser router here. And then we need to set up the switch, right? So I'm gonna add the switch in. So if anybody's familiar with like switch case blocks and some programming languages like JavaScript has them, for example, where you have a bunch of different options that you can choose from, that's essentially what this switch component is doing. So inside of switch, then we can define our different routes. And the routes are essentially different like menu items, right? So we can say, all right, for our initial path, this is what's in the URL. I want to render a very specific component, and I want to render home. And then also, if it's home, I also want to render home, right? So I can get rid of this home here, and now that's set up. All right. Now the next thing that we want to make is going to be the vehicles component, right? So let's, on here in screens, I'm going to make another folder. So let's navigate back into our React front end, right? go into source, into screens, and we have our home folder. I want to make a vehicles folder, right? And inside of that, we'll make a vehicles.js file. All right, and let's just take what we have here in home and copy and paste that in for our starting point, right? And in this case, the class isn't going to be home. We're going to call it vehicles, right? And the only thing that we really need in here is just a H2 that says vehicles. And so now that we have vehicles, I need to import it, similar to home. So import vehicles from screens. All right. And then we'll add that as one of the available routes, vehicles. And we're going to resolve this vehicles component in. While we're waiting on the React router DOM to finish up, do you guys have any questions? I know I'm going a little bit fast, but I see we're starting to run out of time here. Nobody's curious about JSX? All right. Well, if you guys are have any questions or confused, just feel free to stop me. Now that we've got this set up, once this finishes loading, I can actually show you how we're going to navigate between the different options here, right? Something that we're going to need. If you guys remember that API GET that we defined here on the front end, so look here back at the that script file. This is going back to what we wrote before. We wrote this API GET. We're going to need to write a similar utility to be able to use inside of React here. So I'm going to go in front end React into source, and I'm going to make another folder called utils. Right, and inside of utils, make a file called api.js. And then in that file, the same way that we define that other method, we need to provide the API base URL, which is going to be HTTP localhost 9500. And then we want to make a method that's going to send an HTTP GET request to the API. And we want to be able to import that into our other files, right? So I'm going to say export const, call the method GET. And this is going to be another anonymous function. So inside, as the argument, we'll have a path argument. And then we need to build up the URL. And instead of path, let's just call this route, because that's what we called it before. And then to build up that URL, it's the API base URL, and then the route, right? And then what we want to do, this is running in the browser, remember? So it actually also has access to the fetch command, right? And so we can pass that URL in, and we're going to use the same options as before. So the method is a get method. The headers, we're going to have content type, application JSON, call then because it's returning a promise, right? And for the response, we just would return the JSON back. So that's all we need there. right? And then what we're going to do is we're going to import this into our vehicles component in order to sit there and request the vehicles from the back end, just like we did in the other case. Now, one thing that we're going to need, we got this router set up, but we don't have anything to switch the URL itself, right? So we need to set up a nav bar. So inside of this lib here, I'm going to make a nav bar folder, right? And like that example from Netflix, right? We have that nav bar up the top. That's what's going to represent the navigation. And inside of there, we just make a nav bar component. So let's copy and paste our homes component in here just to give a skeleton to work with, right? And then, like all of them, you have to import React. The next thing that this nav bar is going to need to import is going to be something called link from React Router DOM. All right. And then what it's going to return, call this nav bar. We'll have a nav element. And then we'll have an unordered list, right? Recall we had an unordered list before. Now for the list item, we don't use the A tags. And here is where we're going to use these link tags. And these are set up, these components are set up to work with the React Router DOM library. So one of the attributes in this link tag is the to, so that's where it's linking to. It's just like your href, right? But it's internal for React Router DOM. And for the text, it'll just be home. And then we'll have another list element, and that's going to go to vehicles. Right? And that's all we need. So to tie this all together, let's go back to app.js, and we want to import the nav bar. That's going to be from lib navbar, and we'll import that navbar component. Right? And what we're going to do, we're going to put that navbar just like we had before. We'll put it right under our H1. All right, so let's take a look at this thing. It should be compiled. Let's hopefully, all right, we're compiled successfully. What we got? All right, look familiar, everybody? We're about there. So here's your home, welcome home, vehicles, vehicles. Right, we haven't loaded in our vehicles yet. BJ, what do you think on time? We're at midnight right now.
Yeah, I mean, it depends. How fast can you actually get this thing built?
And another 15 minutes.
All right, let's do it. Yeah, because you only basically need to render. You basically need to wrap that in a for loop to render those vehicles. So
yeah, the only thing we need to finish is that vehicle screen.
Yep, let's do the vehicle screen. That's where React really starts to shine. There's a lot of boilerplate we just did right now, but really you're going to see where React is very powerful is right here.
Yeah, and you'll be able to see this scales really well. I mean, you keep adding layers and layers and layers, and you don't have to rewrite a bunch of code. It's nice and compartmentalized. So let's get started. So we'll open up. If you recall, what's going on here, right? We've got our H1 tag. This is our nav bar, right? And then we've clicked on vehicles, which loaded the vehicle component. Click on home, that loads the home component. So what we need to update now is the vehicles component, right? To hit that back end and load every single vehicle. So let's open up our vehicles component, right? And then we need to be able to hit the back end. So let's import that API tool, right? I'm just going to say import star as API from the utils folder API, right? These dots just go back up into parent directories, which takes you back up into this utils, right? And then star as API, this is equivalent to that just straight require statement. The reason I'm doing that is because I want to be able to say API.get, right? And for vehicles, so components in React, they actually get their own internal state, which is nice. So we're going to declare a state variable here. And what I want here, I'm going to have a vehicles or a vehicle list, and I'll initially say it's just an empty array. We're going to have vehicle data, and have that as an empty object, and then I'll add the last thing later once we get there. So when this guy mounts to the DOM, there's a couple of different lifecycle methods that are available. And one of the ones that are available, and you can see this from the Facebook docs when you go into that reactjs.org page. One of the ones that's available is called component did mount. And this you get from the React component. So you're inheriting from that, and it has this method. So as soon as that component gets mounted onto the DOM, this function here will fire. And so what we want to do is once it gets mounted, we want to call API get, right? And for the route parameter, we're going to request vehicles from the backend, right? And then we can call then. We've got our JSON data now, right? This is coming from the backend. And then there's another method that's available to the vehicles class, and it's called this.setState. Now, this is a variable that's internal to classes that just says, I'm referring to this object, right? This particular instance of the vehicles class. And then when we set state, that's to affect this state. And it has to do with the way all of the rendering works within React, but you should only ever edit your state through the set state API. And then what we're going to do is in particular, we're actually going to update the vehicle list. So we're just going to set this vehicle list equal to the JSON data, since that's what we get back from the backend, right? And then what we want to do now is actually return this JSON data. Let's leave it like that for now. All right. And then in here in the render method is where the interesting stuff happens. So inside of the render method, it'll re-render anytime that the state of the component changes. And so what you can do is we can, similar to the way we destructured the different arguments for React Router DOM, we can destructure from this.state. And we're gonna grab the vehicle list, the vehicle list from this.state. So this is this vehicle list here, right? So as soon as it mounts, it's gonna do a request and it gets that vehicle list. So if I actually console log this right now, you should be able to see inside of the console a list of all the vehicles, right? Why is it 0? It's because we reset vehicles in. So let's actually load those in. So I'm going to go back up into week 3 live, right? You can see we've got our cloud. I'll call node index.js to fire up the backend. We're listening on 9500. And then I need to go back up a level. I'll go into the client, right? Activate. This is the Python client, remember, that has the vehicle data. I'll activate this, and then I'll run main in order to load up those vehicles, right? So now when we refresh this page and we look into that console log, you should see an array of those vehicles, right? So this has access to those vehicles now in its render method, right? So what are we going to do with that? Well, what we want to do is we're going to actually create like virtually little cards that represent each of the vehicles, and let's store those in a list. So I'm going to make something called a vehicle card list, and I'll set that equal to, this is some JavaScript trickery here, but what I'm saying is vehicle list 2 ampersands vehicle list.length. The reason I'm doing this is because vehicle list could be null before this initial state gets started. So this just makes it so you don't try to call a property on a null variable, which would cause an error in JavaScript. And then we're going to use a tertiary operator. So this means that if there are vehicles, then we're going to render something, right? But if there aren't, then we're just going to return a p tag. And I'm just going to return an empty div here for now. We're going to return a p tag that just says no vehicles found yet. That's in the case that it can't find anything and the vehicle list isn't primed, right? So I'll just say no vehicles found yet, right? And so here's where we want to return the actual vehicles. All right, so what are we going to do here? We're going to say this is going to be our vehicle list, and then we're going to map over each vehicle. I'll create the heading for the vehicle. All right, this is the string we had before. Vehicle.year, vehicle.make, and vehicle.model. And then what I want to return is an array of JSX. All right, so I'll create a div here. To hold everything. Now, when you are returning an array of objects for JSX, you have to provide keys that are all unique. And what we'll use is we'll actually use vehicle.id, right? And then inside of this, we're going to have an H3 heading. And we're going to insert this. Now we're starting to insert some JavaScript inside of the HTML for this JSX. We're going to insert what we get for vehicle heading here. All right, let's stop right there real quick. And so what I want to do is, underneath of this header tag, I actually want to return this vehicle card list. All right, this is all within that render method. So let's check it out. All right, there you go. So we can see we've got our 3 different vehicles, and now we just need to load up the info and the images, and we're almost there. So let's go ahead and we're going to load some more stuff up. If you guys remember, this was all being done with like document.create element, right? It was all being done manually through that web API. Now we can write this like it's essentially like JavaScript. So I can make an unordered list, right? And then I can make my list items. I can just say ID is going to be your vehicle.id. Copy and paste this. We can say your name is vehicle.name. This is our color. And then another dot. And then finally, after that unordered list, let's just add the image tag here, right? So the source we have to get from the vehicle data, which is image URL, right? And then the alt, what we set before was the vehicle heading. All right, let's see where we're at now. We got a hot reload, awesome. So we've got our photos in, right? Our IDs, name, color, no data yet. So that's gonna be the last step, get our data loaded. All right, so what we need to do now, guys, is on this component did mount, once, remember, we have to get the data for the vehicles, right? But once we get the data, now now what we're gonna do is we're gonna set up those requests for the latest data routes, right? So once we get this data back, we can call then on the promise. Now we've got our vehicle list. And then we're gonna set up polling for the latest data for each vehicle. And so we've got this vehicle list here. We can map over it. We've got each vehicle. and then we're going to call that set interval, right? We're running those at 1,000 milliseconds, so 1 second per request, right? And then our path, or actually our route in this case, is going to be vehicles. And then it's going to be, right, the vehicle ID, latest data. So this is what's going to the back end. And then the API is going to send a GET request to that route. And once it gets the data, we're going to grab the old data that's available off the state, vehicle data, right? And this is this vehicle data right here on state. And then we want to call set state. We're going to say vehicle data is going to be equal to, we call the spread operator for the old data. Why am I doing this? It's because we're calling this, when we're mapping through these vehicles, we're calling this multiple times. And you need to make sure that you don't wipe out the data for the other vehicles. So we spread it to grab, you know, essentially the IDs from the other vehicles. And then we'll add in as a key the vehicle ID and provide the latest data right here. All right. And in case this fails, we'll add a catch here. Just log get request to route failed, right? And just console log the error. And then when that's done as well, the other thing we want to do is we're going to want to actually cancel these intervals when it closes, but I'm going to wait a second to do that. So we ended up setting latest data here, right? And this is available here on vehicle latest data, but we're not actually rendering it, but we can see it. So we can destructure it here from the this.state, right? Or call it's right here on the state, right? And I'm going to console log this vehicle data just to show you guys that these requests are coming in. Now we just need to render them. So you see it's empty, and now these UIDs are building up, and it's one of them's for each of them, right? No data available, but it is getting it from the back end. There's not gonna be any data available until we actually start running the simulation, right? But let's at least load that up here for each vehicle card. So coming down here, here's our latest data, right? And now, instead of these 3 dots, let's actually grab the vehicle data. So we'll say vehicle data, get the ID, right? Get the data for that particular vehicle. And if there is data, this is just a shorthand, if this isn't null, right? Because this would be undefined essentially if this vehicle ID was in the data list. If it does exist, we can do another JSON stringify of this data. And then otherwise, we just return the 3 dots. Right? So we go back to the screen. Now you can see it's actually getting that JSON in. Right? So let's go ahead and run our simulation. There you guys have it. It's loading it up.
And you guys just saw some really crazy JavaScript stuff. You saw a spread operator. You saw, you know, some what we call a ternary operator to do comparisons. So watch this again. Google around, you know, open up your own file, play around with that spread operator. It's a very powerful thing, but it's going to take some time getting used to it because that syntax is like no other syntax in any other language. It's a very JavaScript, kind of centric thing. So you're starting to see it introduced in other languages, but it's a very JavaScript thing. So take a look at it, really digest it. That stuff will get a lot more normal. What we can do in office hours, JC, on Tuesday, I think, is going over that spread operator and what another way to write it in maybe a more natural way that's not as JavaScript centric. That'll kind of help bring the points home as to what kind of crap was going on and all that syntax stuff.
Yeah, it almost seems like witchcraft, right?
Mm-hmm. It is. I mean, it's JavaScript, so necessary evil. Nice. Any questions? Are we done?
The only thing that's left now is actually getting a hold of the interval handles and then clearing them once you do a component did unmount, because this has a memory leak if you switch between the components.
Well, let's they can take our word for it. There's going to be a memory leak. Why don't we fix it and then we can push it and let them go?
Yeah, I'll let you guys go.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, guys.
See you on Tuesday.
See ya.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
See you on Tuesday.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Have a good one, guys.
Good night. Thank you. We lost it, to be honest, in the middle. I need to go and look back to all the videos again.
Yeah, especially the one that started off with React. No, it's
Oh yeah, yeah, the React stuff is, that's another thing. Yeah, we just wait till we get to an advanced front end. Oh man, we haven't even scratched the surface of React with hooks and context. Oh, it's going to be great.
Yeah, React is its own thing to learn in and of itself, right? It's a pretty nice framework, but
yeah, it's pretty deep.
Just a quick question.
Sure.
Yeah, actually, this is totally unrelated to what we did today. Turns out my dev container has failed once I did the git pull to update it. So I'm gonna work on it and try to see if I'm able to get it up and running. Just one question. I'm a little behind on it. Last week's exercise, I have to do it. So say if you do any push based on today's update, that shouldn't stop me from, if I kind of do a git pull, that shouldn't stop me from practicing last week's exercise.
No, because we'll push it. We'll push week 3 separately, so that you basically keep that week 2, so you can,
Okay.
it won't get.
I think now I'm getting the same error that this office hours we were looking at Shweta's error. So, so I'm gonna try work on it a little bit, and if I struggle with it, then I'll reach out to you, JC.
Okay. Yeah, definitely do that.
Thank you.
There may be some build errors with that Ubuntu image. That's frustrating. Okay. That's the downside of open source code. Don't really have any control over when they change it.
Oh, all right. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Nice work, Jason.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Good night.
Good night.
hi guys.
Nice work, JC.